What this book offers. 1. Long-term wealth through growth investing. Fisher emphasizes investing in companies with strong growth potential rather than chasing short-term market trends. 2. The 15 points to look for in a common stock. The book gives a detailed checklist for evaluating whether a company is a worthwhile investment, covering everything from R&D strength to management integrity. 3. Scuttlebutt method. Fisher introduces a concept of gathering information from customers, suppliers, competitors, and employees to truly understand a company's quality and prospects, a technique still valued by top investors like Warren Buffett. 4. Focus on quality companies, not cheap stocks. Rather than buying undervalued or cheap stocks, Fisher advises investing in high-quality businesses with long-term potential, even at premium prices. 5. Importance of management. One of Fisher's big themes is evaluating the integrity and competence of a company's management team, which he considers critical for sustained success. 6. Hold for the long haul. The book encourages holding investments for years or even decades, allowing compounding and business growth to do the heavy lifting.
Preface. What I learned from my father's writings. This book grows on you. I know because it grew on me. It took me about 15 years to understand common stocks and uncommon profits. When I first read the book, it made darned little sense. I was 8. It was a waste of the start of a perfectly good summer vacation. Too many big words that required I use a dictionary. Ugh. But it was my father's book, and I was proud of him. I had heard at school and from neighbors and had read in the local paper that his book was making a big splash. I was told that it was the very first investment book ever to have made the New York Times bestseller list, whatever that meant. I felt it was my absolute duty to read it. So I did, and when completed, I was glad to be finished and free for the summer. Who knew that I would later go on to found a large investment management firm serving thousands of clients, write my own books, and become the 6th longest-running columnist in Forbes magazine's formidable 80-plus-year history, or that I would write numerous annual, best of the year, investment book reviews and recommend dozens of books over the decades to readers. And, yes, maybe it helped en route that I could say I'd read my first investment book when I was 8, even if I didn't understand it. The book next seriously crossed my mind at age 20 as I faced college graduation. Father had offered me a job working with him and my older brother. Anxious, but skeptical, I was curious to see if this job was really an opportunity. So, I read Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits again. Reading about my father's 15 points to look for in a stock, I wondered if I could apply them to a local stock. If so, I thought this would affirm the benefit of working with my father. Well, it didn't work. There was a local publicly traded lumber stock, Pacific Lumber, that looked like a good profit opportunity. But the few folks I approached weren't impressed with some wannabe kid sleuth seeking competitive detail who was clearly ill-prepared to analyze or do anything with it. I didn't even know how to ask meaningful questions. After being shut out by the first few folks I approached with my fact-seeking questions, I gave up. But it showed me that I needed quite a bit of polishing. Working for my father was a bumpy ride, a bit like my first professional stock purchase, a reverse 10-bagger. It fell from 10 to 1. I tell you all this only so you can see that even a kid in his 20s, without a lifetime at the top of his school class, having never attended a big-name university, and with no major accomplishments under his belt to brag on, even that kid could go on and in just a few years learn to effectively use the principles in this book. And so can you. The 15 points. Ultimately, when you're a young man starting out in the industry as I was and haven't yet bought any stocks, figuring out what to buy seems immediately more important than figuring out what to sell. Fortunately, this book teaches that if you figure out the right things to buy, selling becomes a lot less important because you can hold the stocks you own longer. And what to buy derives directly from my father's 15 points. Applying his 15 points was a repeatable real-world experience linked to scuttlebutt, as he described it, all aimed at researching one stock here, another there. And it worked. I will not here recount in detail the successes that the 15 points helped me achieve early in my career. But I gained tremendous career momentum by discovering a handful of great stocks that did wonderful things for me. From the 15 points, I could fathom generally where a firm fit into the world and how it would or wouldn't prosper. If it wouldn't, what might its hiccups be? I soon understood why my college try at the 15 points failed. The craft is in the scuttlebutt, which, like all craft, takes time to learn. Scuttlebutt is simply about finding out from real, Main Street sources if a firm is strong or weak. Most folks don't use this approach, relying instead on the local rumor mill and Wall Street noise, most of which is aimed at selling you product. As the century ended and a new one began, the power of scuttlebutt should have been obvious to folks, but it wasn't. If you had applied the 15 points in this book and got your information sources from Main Street instead of Wall Street, you would never have bought any of the scandal stocks that so penetrated the news of the 2000 to 2002 bear market. The likes of Enron, Tyco, and WorldCom are always easily avoided. Those who fell for these stocks depended on gossip and Wall Street opinion rather than on Main Street verification of the business's strengths. The 15 points are about very fundamental business features that can't be faked. Scuttlebutt means avoiding malarkey mills and seeking information from competitors, customers, and suppliers, all of whom have a vested interest in the target company, and few of whom have any reason to see the firm unrealistically. It means talking to the sales representatives of a company's competitors, who inherently have a basis to see the target company negatively but typically don't if the target is great. It means talking to the research people and management people of competitors as well. If all those folks see reality and strength in the target's operations and respect it and even fear it, well, simply said, it isn't Enron or Adelphia. You can count on it. Scuttlebutt itself can be a sort of art form that identifies characterizations of the 15 points. It's the difference between learning to play the piano and then composing. Art takes time to learn. You probably won't compose until you're pretty competent at playing. In almost any field, you can learn craft by repetition, but not otherwise. You may appreciate the art without any ability to create it yourself. Or, after mastering craft, you may turn yourself into an artist. But this book allows you to sense the art, and fortunately it doesn't take that long to learn because a lot of it is common sense. The problem for most folks is that they don't know that this common sense can be applied, and hence they don't try. But Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits shows you how. Think about the 15 points for a moment. I know you haven't read them yet. Let me describe in a straightforward way what they prescribe, and you will immediately see how universally desirable the attributes are. You can read them in more detail in my father's words and savor them. My father's 15 points are a prescription for what to buy. They describe a firm with huge product and market potential and a management determined to continue exploiting that potential far beyond the current product generation. The prescription means an existing research effectiveness to create future product, linked to a sales force size and efficiency that will overcome all obstacles in carrying existing and future product to market. That is very futuristic. It means enough raw product profitability, combining gross profit margins and the ratio of gross profits to administrative costs to pay for the whole darn thing. It means a real, concrete plan to maintain and to improve that profitability and happy employees at all levels, in depth, who will be loyal and productive, again futuristic, and open-ended, never-ending. Then, too, it means tight, great cost controls and some aspect, peculiar to its industry, that allows the target to excel relative to others in the industry. And, finally, all that must be wrapped up and guided by an open, articulate management of unquestionable integrity. Consider the scandal stocks or other overvalued portfolios. Not a one could have passed the test via scuttlebutt because if you talked to competitors, they weren't overly scared of those slinky firms. If you talked to customers or suppliers, they weren't overly impressed either. The customers weren't impressed because the products weren't all that good by relative comparison. The vendors and suppliers weren't all that impressed because the vendors' other customers would have been doing better and ordering more. The real sales volume wasn't there. And the competitors would not have held these firms in awe because they were not held by them at competitive disadvantage. Not only would the 15 points have easily eliminated all scandal stocks of the 2000 to 2002 bear market, they would have also eliminated all the so-called 95% club, the tech stocks that lost 95% or more of their value during the bear market because they were internet pipe dreams, or whatever, with basically 1999 hype but nothing real there. Think of how many internet stocks had no real sales force, and no profit margin at all, and no plan to achieve profitability, much less improve it, and no fundamental research, and no ability to exist without future equity financing. And they couldn't have made it on half the 15 points. Then, too, the 15 points by exclusion would have eliminated quite a lot of other companies. But think of the firms of the prior decades that the 15 points would not have eliminated. They would XIV have hooked you into real firms, whether cheap or expensive, and would have allowed you to navigate the tricky currents of financial market volatility, whether your own personal inclinations were toward growth stocks or value stocks, small stocks, or big ones. Goals versus scuttlebutt. My father's goals and mine were never the same. But this book works for both our goals and for yours, too. My father was almost always a growth stock investor, almost always. It was simply who he was. I was, in my youth, for a variety of reasons, a value guy. These days, I'm either a value, growth, big cap, or small cap guy. I'm kind of prone to go any which way I want, but that is a different story and not for this book. Anyway, as a youth and a value guy, the 15 points served me nicely, getting me into high-quality firms with cheap stocks that as businesses did spectacularly but that were overlooked as stocks in the mid-1970s. He wanted stock in a firm that could grow and grow and grow, and he wanted stock that could be bought at a reasonable price and virtually never be sold. I wanted a dirt cheap stock that was a great firm with a bad Wall Street image, a stock that could grow fundamentally and have a price to multiple expansion so it could be sold at a premium multiple or a big markup in 5 to 10 years. My point, scuttlebutt and the 15 points work for growth stocks or value stocks, for big cap stocks or small cap stocks. Take point 4, an above average sales organization is as important, or maybe more so, to a value firm without great natural sales momentum behind it as it is to one with the wind to its back. It is also critical for a small firm that wants to overcome larger brethren. And an above-average sales organization is hard to accomplish but needed for a huge firm that wants to stave off a myriad of small venture capital-funded one-a-best swarming mass capital after its market. Ditto for point 5 about a worthwhile profit margin. For example, in a commodity-type business, without natural growth, it is true that market share, relative production costs, and long-term profit margins all tend to be pretty tightly linked. Good management gains market share and lowers relative production costs, often by introducing enhanced production technology. Bad management simply but irregularly lowers margins until they disappear. Hence, in 1976, I discovered Nucor, a tiny low-cost steel vendor. Great management, innovative technology, lower production cost, high relative market share in tiny steel niches, gaining market share, and adding niches. I bought it as a value guy. My father followed me and promptly bought Nucor as a growth guy. Same 15 points. I sold some years later at a huge profit, and my father held it for decades, selling at a much larger profit, by which time it had become the second largest U.S. steel manufacturer. I think my father, who was 51 when this book came out and a bit of an eclectic genius and already very successful, failed to see how the understanding of the craft, turning into an art, which had come to him slowly and intuitively over the years, would take time for a neophyte to learn. He regularly thought of things in his life differently than how he initially explained them. It was a quirky part of how his brain worked. As I write today, I am 52, almost the same age as he was then, and I know, because I had to learn the process rather than invent it, that it takes time to learn. I'm more linear than my father was and in many ways more introspective, and I urge you to read this book multiple times spanning your investment life. Take Scuttlebutt, again. The Scuttlebutt chapter is only 3 pages long. But they are among the book's most important pages. It is clear to me, in retrospect, that my father simply skipped the craft part of what otherwise might have been in the book. He just assumed it. Over the years, I applied this process to lots of stocks on an individual basis, gaining great insights. The key? Focus on customers, competitors, and suppliers. I described the craft in my first book, Super Stocks, including how to do it with several real-world examples. My book was a good book, 1984 to 1985's best-selling stock market book. And I'm proud I wrote it. But it was not nearly as good as this book. Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits had much less that would become obsolete over time than my first book had, and while both books introduced new concepts, my father's new concepts were more radical for their day and more uniformly applied and more timeless, which is what makes it such a great book. My book was mostly about craft, not art. With craft, whenever you ask, you get answers. The art is to get more questions and the right questions flowing from the answers you receive to prior questions. I've seen people who rigidly run down a standard question list, regardless of the responses they get. That isn't art, you ask, he or she answers. What question best flows from the answer? And so on. When you can do that well on a real-time basis, you are a composer, an artist, a creative and investigative investor. That is what my father in his prime did best. I went with my father about a jillion times to visit companies between 1972 and 1982. I worked for him for only a year, but we did lots of things together after that. In looking at companies, he always prepared questions in advance, typed on yellow pages with space in between so he could scribble notes. He always wanted to be prepared, and he wanted the company to know he was prepared so they would appreciate him. And he used the questions as a sort of outline of topics to be covered. It was also a great backup in case the conversation went cold, which occasionally it did. Then he could get things back on course instantly with one of his prepared questions. But his very best questions always popped out of his mind, unprepared, never having been written down in advance because they were the angle he picked up on the fly, as he heard an answer to a lesser question. Those creative questions were the art. It is what, in my mind, made his querying great. His mind was financially facile until he was pretty darned old. I want to tell you about one of the best questions I never heard him use in person and only heard about later from James Michaels. It wasn't in his books, but it would have made a great addition anywhere. A great honor of my life was that for 15 years before his retirement I was edited personally in Forbes by the great James Walker Michaels, who at his retirement as editor of Forbes in 1998 was beyond doubt the dean of U.S. business journalism. He brought me into Forbes, took a personal interest in me, and edited virtually every column I wrote by himself until his retirement as editor. He also admired my father greatly. Once, and only once, Jim and I had a reason to spend a weekend together on the West Coast, and he hoped to come a few hours early and sit down with my father, who then would have been just shy of 89. They met for a few hours in a conference room at my firm's headquarters on top of Kings Mountain, in California. Jim and I then drove north a few hours toward the Russian River in our destination, and en route Jim kept asking me about that question. I had no clue what he was talking about, and I knew my father better than anyone in the world. It embarrassed me that I had no idea what he was seeking from me. For about an hour, Jim staggered trying to put it together and pretty much gave up. As often happens with our minds, when he quit trying, it popped right out, and he said, "What are you doing that your competitors aren't doing yet?" What a great question. The emphasis was on the word yet. Staggering. Most folks, when you ask them that question, aren't doing one darn thing of any great significance their competitors aren't already doing and feel awestruck that you asked them this and they hadn't thought of it themselves. The firm that is always asking itself that question never becomes complacent. It is never caught behind. It never starves for intellectual grist to chew through toward a better future. It is the firm that, coupled with integrity and raw management intellect, lives the 15 points. What are you doing that your competitors aren't doing yet, implies driving the product market, forcing others to follow, and dominating for the betterment of customers, employees, and shareholders, which is sheer greatness. Jim's question both summed up my father's lifelong aspirations and summarized the gist of his 15 points. And where he got it from I still don't know to this day. But it is a stunningly cunning question. Jim, who always had a nose for the twist that made a great story, returned to New York after our weekend and composed a Forbes article wrapped around that question. It combined the best of Jim and my father, and the whole thing reminded me of how often in my life I was the plodding, mechanical flywheel around my father's eclectic brilliance. I'm not meaning to demean myself. I've done very well in life, but I am more linear, more deductive, harder working, more driven, and more direct than my father, who was vastly more a nonlinear genius. My firm has applied the 15 points and scuttlebutt to firms of most varieties, although primarily smaller, beat-up ones. Retailers, technology companies of various forms, service firms, concrete, steel, specialty chemicals, consumer products, gambling, you name it. The 15 points hasn't always been the final decisive phenomena that compelled me or the firm, but they often added value. I've always felt free to pretty much do my own thing. While contemplating on a large scale and attempting to reach conclusions on hundreds of stock yearly, my firm mass-produced the process for many years in a process we called 12-call, which was run off an operations manual with remote location workers doing telephone interviews of customers, competitors, and suppliers. It wasn't as powerful by far as doing it yourself on a single stock, but it let us cover lots of ground. Today, we have replaced that with subsequent capital markets technology, but that is, again, another story and outside the scope of this book. Preface. Today my firm is managing many billions of dollars aimed at a handful of different goals while buying stocks around the globe and using 500 plus employees. You probably aren't doing that. You therefore shouldn't do what I'm doing, and I shouldn't do what you need to do. If you're an individual, all of the 15 points still apply. Tactically, you use them the way I did as a young man when I didn't have the machine I have today. And you can't cover the turf I now can, but that probably isn't necessary or even desirable to you. My point is that the 15 points are worthwhile whether used exactly as my father originally envisioned them or on an altered, more superficial but more mass spectrum basis, for domestic or foreign stocks, for growth, or value, or, for that matter, if you move away from public stocks to buy private businesses, many or just that one that you might want to own and operate personally, no matter how small. All of the same principles apply. Much more available. Now, don't get the idea that the only worthwhile parts of common stocks and uncommon profits are scuttlebutt and the 15 points. It's just that I think they are the jewels. There are smaller sparkles, too, bits of wisdom well worn. For example, by 1990 I'd been a professional for 18 years and fairly successful. I'd been a Forbes columnist for 6 years. Enter Saddam Hussein. As the threat of war grew, investors grew timid. The market buckled. I've studied quite a bit of history and written 2 financial history books. The history as I saw it said, bye. But I hadn't lived that much history. One weekend, I buttressed my resolve by reviewing Chapter 8, 5 Don'ts for Investors, and Chapter 9, 5 More Don'ts for Investors, in Part 1. And I knew that the war scare had to be a market buying opportunity. From it, along with some of my economic forecasting, came my well-timed late 1990 buy columns. Timing that right, when most others were bearish, helped secure my long-term place in Forbes, for which I've always been grateful. But you might have found the same things useful more recently as we had the 2000 to 2002 bear market in what could be thought of as Saddam Hussein II. As I write, in 2002, we have had the worst bear market since, depending on how you look at it, My early career in 1974 or the Great Depression in 1937 to 1938. Many have had their faith in prior investment beliefs shattered. Many have developed newfound faith in other concepts that they will soon surely find shallow, vapid, and void of eternal truth. What would my father say looking forward? He would say simply that capitalism will prevail and the United States and the Western world will progress, that you can debate where the market bottom is, and that he rarely considered himself to be very good at that. He would say that if you own companies that have the 15 points and don't get carried away by what he referred to as fads and fancies, you will come through this period just fine. He would say that if you don't own stocks, this is a perfectly fine time to buy companies that possess his 15 points. The bear market of 2000 to 2002 has seen to that. Might they go lower before they go up? He would always acknowledge that possibility. But he would say that it won't matter much a few years from now. Would he contemplate cutting, running, and selling out to avoid the market here? Not for a moment. There is nothing he would be less likely to do. Yes, he did lighten up on stocks several times in his ultra-long career, but only when he could know that the market hadn't fallen yet and still might, not after it had fallen, hoping it would fall still more. Would my father fear Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden, or terrorists? No. Would he fear war? He tells you directly in these pages that he would not. Would he admire President Bush for pointing us toward war? No. He rarely admired presidents because he saw them as politicians and he came to not much care for politicians, and the few he ever cared for weren't so high up. He said, the higher they go, the liar they get. And he hated war and rarely could see its justification. Would he have worried about the myriad of other negatives in contemporary media, like corporate integrity, double-dip recession possibilities, high market price-earnings ratios, the risk of Brazil defaulting, or whatever? No, not much. He would have used this time while authors focused on the wrong things to refocus on the basic fundamentals of the firms he owned and to see if he should still own them. And in looking at the weakest among them, he would be contemplating if there were one or two better firms he could find somewhere to replace them. He always saw volatile, down markets as a great opportunity to upgrade the quality of his few stocks. And the more folks fretted about the market, the more he would be fretting about what he owned and didn't own. Preface. Late in his career, when asked about market timing or sector issues, he would say something like, well, my son has proven he can navigate those waters much better than I've ever been able to, and here is what he says. But, I still wouldn't trust him. He never trusted anyone to make those kinds of decisions for him. He trusted the ownership of firms that possessed his 15 points to take care of him. And he would today. Many times in my career, someone would tell me that I was wrong and that my father never would have done what I'm doing. I would always know generally that this person clearly didn't know my father's brain one iota as well as I did, and that he or she almost certainly hadn't read his writings as often as I had. So, I never much worried about people's assessment of what my father would and wouldn't have done. My point here is that even being the one who knew him best, in a business sense, I read him more than most. Even if you understand the material really well, you will benefit from rereading these pages multiple times as your investing life progresses, and you will hurt yourself if you rely solely on the lessons from one reading. First, they fade in your mind. Second, the more you read them, the more you get out of them. Without meaning to sound heretical, it is like a little investing Bible, a book that is meant to be read multiple times and whose usefulness does not end with the last page. You will find lots of other jewels of your own in these pages that may do as much for you as they have for me. But an important concluding point to make on common stocks and uncommon profits is to note its sheer fundamentalness. Not only does it teach the true basics of fundamentals of investing, but it has also been a core part of the training of many leading investment practitioners. For many years, it has been part of the curriculum in the investment class at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Students of all forms passed through Stanford, read the book, and went on to become some of the nation's leading investors. But the book's breadth was broader than that. For example, Warren Buffett has long credited my father in Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits as being fundamental to the development of his investment philosophy. The first of my father's don'ts in Chapter 9, Don't Overstress Diversification, gets you quickly to a key cornerstone of Buffettism. And you can find it in the very same place Buffett first did. Not much of great importance to market fundamentalism changed between the writing of my father's first book and that of his third and last book, Conservative Investors Sleep Well. But a lot of water went under the investment bridge, a huge bull market, a huge bear market, 1958 to 1974, lots of fads and fancies. By then my father was 67. His last book was good, but it wasn't nearly what Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits was. He had done it so well the first time that his two subsequent books only made incremental additions. If you can read only one of my father's writing, let it be his first book. It was his best. Still, if you want to read more from my father, his next most important writing was his last book. It was also contributing fundamental ideas. It was a bit topical at the time but has remained timeless. I think in Conservative Investors Sleep Well that Chapter 6's Motorola section is vintage Phil Fisher. In it, he shows why Motorola, which others then didn't like so well, was a great firm and one for which he was personally ready to put his neck on the line in thinking forward a very long time. It's tough to read this section of that book and not appreciate that Motorola was a true quality company. But look what happened afterward. In the next 25 years, the stock appreciated 30-fold, that is, before dividends and all in a safe, well-managed firm, incurring no brokerage costs year to year, no mutual fund operating expense ratios, and not much effort for a true believer. How often does someone give you a successful multi-decade-long look ahead? Darned near never. Would anyone actually hold one stock for all those 25 years? Well, I'm here to tell you for a certainty that one Philippe Fischer did, as his largest personal holding, all the while it was trouncing the Standard & Poor's 500. And that was what Phil Fisher was all about. Finding a very few great companies that he could really know and holding them for a long time while those very stocks appreciated phenomenally. Conservative Investors Sleep Well is simply the best treatise I know on how to buy and hold growth stocks without taking much risk. You could get that, certainly, from either book, his first or his third. The two in many ways are intellectually linked at the bot, separated by 16 years. Still, if you only read one, read Common Stocks. It offers more, is more radical for its time, is better written, is more timeless, covers more turf, and is more intellectual. If you can read both, do it. In the book's second preface, I tell you a little about my father that isn't well known. But over the years, people often asked me about my relationship with my father and son having been in the same industry and all that. And because he was weird, and I'm weird, and preface. Often they are weird, I sometimes give weird answers. For example, when they asked, as they often did, what experience from my memoirs with my father is my favorite, I regularly answered, the next one. That is no more, but it was for a long time. They often tried to pin me down with something like, well, weren't there favorite moments when you were younger? I readily admit there were. He was the world's greatest bedtime storyteller, and his stories had absolutely nothing at all to do with the stock market. Many were his own fictional creations. As a small child, I loved every moment of those stories, and folks like the growing legions of Buffett fills hate that answer. They want some notion about researching some stock. But there was never really a lot of emotion about that. It was just work. So, then, in frustration, I'm often asked, well, if you could distill advice from your father down to a single sentence, what would it be? I'd say, read his writings and try to live them out. And that is what you get with these pages. Enjoy them. Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits and Other Writings. Introduction. Kenneth L. Fisher. This is among the most beloved investment books of all times, among the best-selling of classic investment books, and now 45 years old. My father wrote his original preface at my childhood home in September 1957. It remains herein. 45 years later in October 2002, in my current home, I dare write this book's first new preface in all those decades. If you've read my revised preface, you might think my father is deceased. No. As I write, he is 95 and alive. But he is reduced by the awesome wreckage induced by late stages of aged senile dementia and probably by Alzheimer's disease. He is at home, in bed, about 30 feet away from where he wrote Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits and his other writings. He deteriorates steadily. To those few of us taking care of him, it is startlingly quickly. By the time you read this, he may well be deceased. He will never read these words were they read to him. He couldn't follow their meaning for more than a sentence or two before losing the thread in dangling disconnects cut by his dread disease. He was a great man but is now just a little, old man very late in life. But he is my little, old man. What this disease routinely does to people is nothing to be ashamed of, it is just a disease, not a failing. When I wrote my third book, based on 100 cameo biographies of dead pioneers of American finance, I defined it as dead pioneers only on the premise that dead people don't sue, just in case I got anything wrong. But I also did so because I purposefully didn't want to cover my father in any regard. I didn't want to say anything that might hurt him if I interpreted him differently than he might have wished, which I well might have. Introduction. Now I need not worry about that because he won't know what I say here. So it is time to tell you a bit about the man who wrote one of the best beloved investment books of all time. I'm best qualified to do so because I know him better than anyone if you combine business and personal matters. Oh, certainly, in other ways my mother, his wife, knew him far better than anyone. My aunt, his sister, knew him longer than anyone. But their relationships were basically personal, not business. Yes, I have an eldest brother who worked very closely with him briefly and was temporarily my business partner and to whom I'm close. But Arthur's professional time span around father was fairly short. He evolved to academic humanities, where he is today. Father always loved Arthur foremost of his three sons, and Arthur was more emotionally linked to father than I was. But Arthur would be first to tell you I spent vastly more business time around father over many more years and had a day-to-day relationship with him when Arthur couldn't, materially because Arthur lived 1,000 miles away. Beginnings. My paternal ancestors were Jewish, mainly from Prague, Czechoslovakia, and Germany, all arriving in San Francisco in the early 1850s. My father's paternal grandfather was Philip Isaac Fisher and was both Levi Strauss's original accountant and the person who opened and closed Strauss's first store for him on a daily basis and served Strauss his entire career. My great-grandfather was not wealthy but at his death was financially comfortable. His wife died young, and his eldest daughter, Caroline, or Carrie, donned an important role caring for her siblings. My grandfather, Arthur Lawrence Fisher, the youngest of 8, adored Carrie, who played partial surrogate mother. Born in 1875 in San Francisco, Arthur Lawrence Fisher graduated from UC Berkeley, and attended Johns Hopkins Medical School, graduating in 1900 and returning to San Francisco to practice medicine as a general practitioner. Later, he developed a specialty in orthopedics, becoming the third orthopedic surgeon west of the Mississippi and a founding member of the Western Orthopedics Society. In 1906, Philip Isaac Fisher died, stalling briefly Arthur Fisher's marriage to Eugenia Samuels. The marriage stalled again behind the infamous 1906 fire and earthquake. Finally they married, and my father was born the next year, on September 8, 1907. He was named originally Philip Isaac Fisher, after his recently deceased grandfather. 4 years later in 1911, my father's sister, his only sibling, was born. She was named Caroline after Aunt Carrie. Aunt Carrie had married well, to a Levi Strauss relative named Henry Sullen, who was introduced to Carrie through her father. Aunt Carrie played an important role in the lives of Fishers for 2 generations, those of both my grandfather and father. Aunt Carrie not only secretly bankrolled my father's education, but also secretly gave my grandfather money to buy a car for father that became serendipitously seminal to his career evolution. And Carrie provided ongoing family social structure that enriched father's fragile emotional existence as a child, a process that continued for decades. If my parents had had a daughter, she would have been named Carrie, as was their first grandchild. Unlike many doctors, my paternal grandfather was largely uninterested in money. He did a great deal of charity work in academic medicine, but he didn't care for business or money. When his private practice patients couldn't pay, he simply cared for them anyway. When he sent out bills that went unpaid, he ignored rebilling or collection attempts. He was thought of by myriad people as saintly for his kind, warm, and generous persona. Fortunately for his immediate family, he had Aunt Carrie to secretly bankroll him behind the scenes. Without Carrie, you likely would never have gotten this book. Father was originally privately tutored. My grandfather didn't believe in the elementary schools of the day, and Aunt Carrie could afford better. Later, father was enrolled in San Francisco's prestigious Lowell High School. He graduated at age 16. Smart, too young, well-educated from tutoring, father was also awkward and lacking in social skills other children normally learn in elementary school. He was frail, brittle, and uncoordinated sports-wise, and being young by comparison, he was small relative to Lowell classmates. So he felt socially insecure, which was furthered by his mother's incessantly critical and negative nature. At 16, father started at UC Berkeley, but later, with financial aid from Aunt Carrie and a car paid for by her, he transferred to smaller and friendlier Stanford University. That transfer also proved fateful. He dutifully returned to San Francisco on weekends, which began with a ritual Friday night family dinner at Aunt Carrie's and Uncle Henry's. These dinners spanned almost 50 years, starting before father's birth, and included even distant family members. The dinners were central to building father's early social skills. My grandparents always attended. Father arrived directly from Berkeley or later Stanford. Carrie's house, which if it existed today would be called a mansion, was built in the 1890s by Uncle Henry on Jackson Street, just off Van Ness. The multi-course feast involved much discourse and after-dinner debate that often turned various family participants combative, something my grandfather loved watching. There were lots of child-aged females, but as the only male of his generation, father became a particular favorite of Uncle Henry, which made these events particularly memorable to father, his one chance as a young man to stand out in a crowd. After dinner, father returned home with his parents, heading back to college Monday morning. To father, Stanford was spectacular. Warm, beautiful, laid back, prestigious, he felt more comfortable at Stanford than at Cal or pretty much anywhere else. Upon graduating at 20, and still insecure but feeling safe at Stanford, he remained in the then brand new first class of the Stanford Graduate School of Business, again secretly underwritten by Aunt Carrie. Father never knew about Carrie's financial largesse on his behalf. Multiple other family members knew. Carrie and my grandfather believed it was better if the beneficiary of the largesse thought it came from a father who earned his savings rather than from a rich aunt who married money. Stanford didn't then have an investment class as it does now, but as father has described in other writings, there was then a class that traveled to visit and analyze local businesses. Father had a car and volunteered to drive the professor, Boris Emmett, so they spent a lot of time together, which had a profound effect on father. He felt he learned more from those car rides with Emmett than from all of his other time at Stanford combined. He described all that better than I could in his 1980 Financial Analysts Research Foundation monograph, Developing an Investment Philosophy, and so I won't tread there. In his original preface to Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits, he described his early business years, so I won't tread that turf either. Middle life. As World War II evolved, father put his business interests on ice and enlisted. Too old and too well educated for ideal cannon fodder, he got lucky. Longtime mentor Ed Heller enlisted ahead of him and pulled some strings. Somehow father was made an instant officer and hence never saw the front line. Instead, he fought the war from behind desks all over mid-America, doing accounting and finance for the Army Air Corps. On day one, he was a lieutenant, which he found awkward. On reporting for duty, in uniform, lower-ranking personnel would salute him, yet he didn't know how to respond. Senior personnel expected respect and appropriate behavior, which he also didn't know how to deliver. It took time to adjust. He hated the military, thought of it as a terrible time, despite admitting quite readily that he was treated well by it. He hated the regimentation, the lack of freedom, and being ordered about. When stationed in Little Rock, Arkansas, he met my mother, Dorothy White, who was also in service there. My mother came from Camden, Arkansas, which is very close to where President Bill Clinton was later raised. Father flipped head over heels for my mother instantly and asked her to marry him only weeks into their relationship. She immediately agreed. In 1944, my eldest brother, Arthur, was born, mother having been sent ahead to San Francisco to be with my grandfather for his medical supervision prior to and after birth. She remained there until father's discharge, whereupon he returned home and renewed his business interests as described in his monograph. Donald was born in 1947 and I in 1950. In between the birth of Donald and me, a daughter died in childbirth. Shortly after I was born, they bought a house on the site where they now live in San Mateo, California, 20 minutes south of San Francisco. But they came to hate the house while loving the acre on which the house sat. They loved the views, the trees, and the landscape. Father ripped the house down and built the house in which I was raised and where he and my mother resided ever after. We rented a house a block away during construction. When complete, the house was big, all white, clean, and austere. In my father's house, everything must be neat to a fault. Possessions in all forms were sparse and exactly in their places or they drove him nuts. He loved the yard until very late in life. He spent almost a complete day each weekend in the bottom of the yard, which was almost wild but with spectacular oak trees and wildflowers. He would weed and tend to his wildlife garden and worry about all the things he fretted about, whether the stock market, politics, family matters, or whatever, and to him that time was a marvel, curative for everything annoying him. It was only as his dementia started, causing him to fall often, that he gave up the garden. Introduction. The late 1950s and the 1960s were the high point of father's life, in my view. In 1958, Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits was published, making him an instant, national star. Locally, it made him sort of the dean of the San Francisco investment community. I doubt anyone had before received so much instant stature from an investment book. Certainly, tied to its era, Benjamin Graham's security analysis took much longer to become prominent. Local names that held sway in 1960 included Dean Witter, who founded and headed that great and locally based brokerage firm. But to Dean Witter, New York was the Mecca. And the public already fathomed that a broker was not a money manager. The then famous Gerald Loeb, also of San Francisco Jewish origin and also a broker, may have been bigger nationally, but he had long gone on to New York and lost the local link. Simply put, in San Francisco by 1960, there was no investment advisory name as noted as father's. Different than today, all Northern California investing activities were geographically centralized in a few blocks around Montgomery and Bush Streets in San Francisco. In that realm father held prestige of which he could have only fantasized in his insecure childhood. There was a provision then in California state law, which still exists, allowing an advisor who maintained fewer than 15 clients and did not hold himself out to the public as an investment advisor both to avoid Securities and Exchange Commission registration and to maintain contracts for compensation for a percent of profits that were otherwise made illegal in 1940, a point most investors don't appreciate today. Before then, scam artists would seek clients, tell half to do one thing, tell the other half to do the reverse, charge 20% of the profit on whatever happened, and pick up 10% of the spread no matter what happened. Hence, percentage of profit contracts were illegal for all investment advisors for more than 40 years unless the person had fewer than 15 clients and did not advertise as an investment advisor. And it was in this way that Father structured his business on his return from military service. With the fame from common stocks and uncommon profits, he could easily maintain as clients a few very wealthy local families who paid him well and yet required no real organization to support him. That allowed him to feel superior to others who required a more public clientele and to remain a very private person, which fit well with his social awkwardness and insecurity. Despite his fame and notoriety, he always felt uncomfortable in the public spotlight and avoided it. Introduction. Flashback to 1945. Herbert Dougal was hired by Stanford and started the Graduate School of Business's first dedicated investment course. In all of history, only 3 people ever taught that course. Dougal taught it from 1946 to 1968, 22 years in all, except for a 2-year sabbatical in 1961 and 1962 when Father taught the course on a part-time, temporary basis. Among Father's students was Jack McDonald, who was hired by Stanford in 1968 and who has taught the course ever since. When Dougal was away, it was largely on my father's reputation deriving from common stocks and uncommon profits and from his alumnus status that caused him to be picked. Father loved it. It revived his youthful love affair with Stanford. Had Dougal not returned, I could envision my father doing that course, part-time, forever. But Dougal did return, and Jack McDonald took over in 1968. By Jack's testimony, it was Father who got him interested in markets. Before that, Jack had been a young Hewlett-Packard engineer who changed the course of his life's work at the junction when he met Father. Jack has since said that Father's major contribution, as seen through common stocks and uncommon profits, is to be the first person to link the models of sustainable growth with the concept of competitive advantage. Today, that is a pretty standard package, but not then. In some ways Jack sees Father more as a seminal strategist than as a stock market innovator or operator. Anyway, for the many students and business folks who hold Stanford in awe and respect its MBAs highly and who think those who took its graduate investment course advantaged, note, for a very long time, that course was taught either by the author of the book you hold in your hand or by his disciple and by only one man before, ever. What a testament to common stocks and uncommon profits one few readers appreciate or know. For a very long time, until after I came to temporarily own the book's rights and then, subsequently, got into a dumb fight with Jack McDonald, Jack always used common stocks and uncommon profits as a formal or informal Stanford textbook for the course. Over the years, not every year, but for many years, Father drove down to Stanford at Jack's request to deliver an annual lecture and answer questions in Jack's class. In May 2000, after many years of absence and with Father well into dementia, Jack asked him to return and lecture. I was scared to death Father would embarrass himself because I knew he wasn't at all the man he used to be. But Father rose to the occasion and had one of his best days in a long time, delivering a rousing lecture and answering all questions from all comers. The whole thing, including Jack's warm introduction of Father, was reprinted verbatim in Volume 15, Number 7, of the Outstanding Investor Digest. As Father's dementia overtook him, he slowly lost more of the memories of past business people he had known. For the most part, the earlier he knew them, the longer he remembered them, and the most recent acquaintances faded first from memory. For example, he remembered many people from the 1950s, whereas he had forgotten pretty much everyone he had known from the 1970s. Dementia is like that. But more emotional memories are embedded deeper in the mind, and Jack McDonald, whom Father met in 1961, 33 years into a 12-year career, was one of the very last business personas to fade from his recollection, demonstrating how much McDonald meant to him. As the 1960s passed, Father became ever less interested in his public image and more interested in being quiet. He fancied himself a great judge of business people and largely was, but he knew that was a private activity. He responded to few local requests for appearances but declined ever more of them, and he wouldn't travel to appear in public ever again. In 1970, at 63, he still didn't have a gray hair on his head. That same year, my oldest brother, Arthur, an ecclesiastical historian by training and a very good one, went to work to join him. 2 years later, I joined. Father's vision was that we would work for a few years and then slowly take over his business. That could never happen. It took me only about a year to realize why. Father was such a stickler for detail and so focused and so socially awkward and insecure that he was absolutely incapable of delegating in any way. So, Arthur and I could never really evolve into any meaningful contributors. I was inherently high energy, rebellious, and emotionally pretty brutal to people, and as soon as I realized Father could never delegate, I knew I had to distance myself from him for both our sakes. Otherwise, there was no opportunity for me, and either he would hurt me or I would hurt him or both. It took Arthur 4 more years to leave, and initially he left to join me. But it is tough for an older brother to join his younger brother as a junior partner, and that wasn't meant to be. So Arthur left the industry and I remained, but separate, interacting but distanced from Father. These years were the first real disappointments since common stocks and uncommon profits appeared. They included both the brutal 1973 to 1974 bear market and the beginning of Father's body starting to slow a bit. In 1977, he was 70, and while he would never admit it and while still exceptionally editor, should this be even? Energetic for a man that age, he wasn't as buoyant as he had been and for the first time began to show the early signs of aging. His hair was thinning and partially gray now. In the afternoon train rides down the peninsula, he started falling asleep regularly. Sometimes in the afternoon, he fell asleep at his desk. He was due, but he couldn't quit. During these years, he determined that he would improve the quality of his holdings by weeding out the weakest among the few he owned to own even fewer of higher quality. In retrospect, and without him fathoming it, what he was doing was cutting down the universe requiring his attention to match diminishing energy. Early in his career, he might have owned 30 stocks, a few big established ones, some mid-sized ones he had bought as smaller companies and still held and would for decades, some small ones for which he had high and long hopes, and a handful of private placement, venture cap, type holdings in tiny amounts that he thought of as icing rather than cake. In the mid-1970s, he steadily and slowly sold the ones he thought less of and concentrated on his favorite holdings, so that by about 1990 he held 6 stocks and by 2000 he held 3. None of it went well. My advice to all investors is to stop making investment decisions of any kind when you get old, whatever old means to you. Stop before you get old. I've watched great investors age, and there are no old, great investors. There are old men who were great, but the process of investing is too vital to allow for old age and future greatness together, and aging becomes more powerful than the prior greatness, which eventually implodes foolishly. In medicine, aged fragility is a great frontier as a future, new recognized, disease, but now it stops all old great investors. There simply are no great octogenarian investors. In his later years, Father could talk well and think well, but he didn't have the clarity for great decisions and his sales were poorly timed, consistently. Late in life, he would say things like he was looking for stocks he could hold for 30 years, which sounded silly for an 85-year-old. People often thought it was charming, which was also pretty silly. I think a lot of other people knew he was doing this because he loved it and couldn't quit, even if it wasn't good for him financially. But he was indulged by everyone, including me. What did I care? If it made him happy, it was fine by me. But some could see that he was a bit like a man hanging around the ballpark with bat and glove, when too old to play. His few late-in-life purchases were not successful. He would have been much better off financially if he had just quit doing anything at the age of 80 or even 70. It wouldn't have mattered if he sold and went into index funds or just held what he owned until he died, as it was his decisions detracted value steadily. His long-held prescription for investors had been to buy great companies and pretty much hold them forever. And he had owned great companies. Had he followed his own prescription late in life and not attempted to fiddle and fix past his prime, he could have held what he owned until death and done far better than he did. I don't recall everything he ever owned, but I recall the main holdings. In 1973, at the market's peak, he owned among then big firms in big amounts Dow Chemical, FMC Corporation, Motorola, and Texas Instruments. Among medium-sized companies in big amounts, he owned Raychem and Reynolds. Those 6 stocks then constituted 2/3 of his net worth. The biggest positions were Motorola, Texas Instruments, and Raychem, and had he held them all until now despite the ravaging of the 2000 to 2002 bear market, he would have done very well. But with the exception of Motorola, they were all sold and the timing was terrible in every case, something he wouldn't have done if he was younger. Among smaller firms, he owned many, all selected between 1968 and 1973, and few did well for him after 1973. The most spectacular by far was a venture capital holding in manufacturing data systems, which went public and then was acquired in the 1980s and in which he made 100 times his money. The earliest of them, Rogers Corporation, he still owns. Motorola he still owns. Late in life, he tended to sell the ones that were long beat up, and often just before they came back to life with spectacular bounces. He did that particularly with FMC and Texas Instruments in the 1980s and Raychem in the 1990s. Also in the 1970s something happened in his mind that I don't understand. His father had practiced medicine until very shortly before he died in 1959. In just a few years, my grandfather got what today would probably be diagnosed as Alzheimer's or some form of dementia. He quickly deteriorated, falling apart and then passing away. But father's analysis was different. He thought his father fell apart because he stopped working, and he concluded that if he stopped working, he, too, would fall apart and die. And so he concluded he had to drive himself on. For the rest of his life, work was life itself. Slowly, he resigned himself to being able to do less, but he pushed himself to do as much as he could and did a remarkable job of it. He saw life as like a muscle. If you worked it hard, it kept working for you, but if you let it relax, it would weaken. Even when, eventually, his dementia forced him to quit working completely, he resented it terribly and believed it would cause his death rather than seeing it the other way around, that his dementia was taking him down whether he worked or not. Even after the dementia was diagnosed, he kept working, with monthly visits to the neurologist to appraise the status of his condition. In 1999, with dementia impairing but not stopping him, I moved his office into his home, into my old bedroom, including everything that remained in his former office. He told his few remaining clients about his condition and they remained with him, but he could hold back the failing memory march for only about 18 months longer. In 2000, he gave up completely. For the next year, he talked to me steadily, asking about writing another book, how to get back into business, whether he could travel around to universities to lecture like he did to Stanford. He even made a stab at writing another book, which he envisioned as what I've learned in the past 25 years. But he only got 7 pages actually dictated. The energy was draining from him almost monthly, and his mental capability steadily diminished. As the disease will do, he talked about plans one morning and forgot them by afternoon. When his career was over after 72 years, he initially became tremendously depressed because his self-image was so linked to his career functioning. As my deceased mother-in-law used to say, old age isn't for sissies. What kind of man? Father was sparse, Spartan, serious with a weird sense of humor linked to plays on words. He loved puns and referred to anyone else's pun as 2/3 of a pun, or pu. When I was a child, my friends were all scared to death of him because he had an unintentional cold stare that pierced right through you. If you didn't know him well, he scared you to death. Dark hair, dark complexion, not big, but scary looking, and often dressed in dark clothes. Had he been 20 years younger and 75 years earlier, he would have looked a bit like the archetypal image of the thin, dark-haired, dark-dressed, bad guy gunslinger in westerns. You could fantasize him saying, "Just one move and I'll plug you." But he didn't plug anyone. He wasn't mean. He just looked mean. He didn't have to say a word. Still, children tiptoed around him and scooted fast to avoid him. Again, he wasn't mean, but he wasn't warm and fuzzy either, and he never, ever praised anyone except my oldest brother, whom he adored from birth. Fact is, I've always known my father held me in high regard, maybe higher regard than almost anyone he ever interacted with, even if he displayed it in strange ways and often not at all. Often not at all. For example, except once when I was 16 that I recall very, very distinctly, he never, ever praised me directly about anything at all until I was well into my 40s. It bothered me when I was young, but I came to accept it. That was who he was. He just wasn't the praising kind. He would tell others how proud he was of me, almost bragging, and I'd hear it from them, but he could never tell me. He later told me he regretted that but hadn't known how to deal with it. This type of communication was difficult for my father. Let me help you put that in perspective by describing a part of his career. Decades before a world of computer screening, he had a methodology he employed for finding new ideas for new stocks. He let it be known that any young investment man could set an appointment to meet him just once and talk investments. Usually he would never see the man again. But if he thought the person unusually capable, he would see him repeatedly and offer to swap ideas over time. He let the other guy know what he was interested in and vice versa, and then over time if they saw something of interest, they would swap ideas. These folks passed on many ideas to father over the decades. Yet he was so clear in what he wanted, relative to the 15 points, and so focused to do nothing else, that in his entire career he essentially only followed any one man into a stock once. Other ideas from that same person he brushed off because they were never quite good enough in his mind, not quite right. He followed the thinking of two particular individuals twice. One of the two had ideas that were money losers both times. The only person he ever followed 3 times was me. He adopted 3 of my stock ideas fully across his client base and for him and my mother and made more than 1,000% on each of them. Those were the most ideas he ever adopted from any one person, ever, and he did well with all of them. Mine all came in the mid to later 1970s, late in his career, which, as I've already told you, was a time when his successes were thinning and should have been, therefore, doubly precious. But let me show you who he was. Of those 3 stock ideas, 2 he never acknowledged to me. The third? More than 15 years later, in my 40s, he sent me a short note to tell me I had done well with it. He owned it still then and years later. When I recalled the other 2 ideas to him, he acknowledged them but no further. No congratulations. No thank you. Because I was always less fearful of him than others were, I verbally kicked at him a bit at times, which I did then, asking who else had he ever gotten 3 successful investment ideas from. He pointed out to me that there was no one, but that wasn't so important. The key was in him, he explained, in knowing which ideas to follow and which to discard, and that he hadn't followed any of my bad ideas. That annoyed me. So, I retorted that he had followed plenty of other people's bad ideas, and then he got mad at me and we didn't speak for about a month. Then he forgot he was ever mad at me, and the subject never came up again. That was who he was: cool, cold, hard, tough, disciplined, non-social, never quitting, ever confident externally but internally often scared. And amazing. I know he respected me, but to the people he respected most, he had the hardest time communicating that directly. What was his daily grind like? In 1958, as Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits was published, father arrived home from work in the late afternoon, changed clothes, ate dinner with the family formally in the dining room, and then retired to the living room, where he read, sometimes business materials but usually library murder mysteries until bedtime. When I was a child, he would take a break at our bedtime to tell my brothers and me bedtime stories, which he lavished on us more on me than on my brothers because I liked them better. Sometimes they were non-fiction history about heroic figures or events, like Joan of Arc, the American Revolution, Paul Revere's Ride, the life of Napoleon. Others were fiction of his own creation, something he hoped eventually to turn into children's books but never did. They were all great. My brothers and I had separate bedrooms, and father would sit on the bed's edge of whomever he was telling the story to. One or more of us would lie on the floor nearby, and when we fell asleep, he carried us to bed. He and mother went to bed about 10. In the morning, he drove us kids to school at 7:30 in a beat-up old blue Oldsmobile and drove on to a point a half-mile from San Mateo's train station. He walked to the station and rode the rails into San Francisco. Early morning San Mateo retailers came to call him the Flash because he walked so fast, leaning forward in a world long before power walking. He believed that if rain wasn't hard, it did no good, and that if walking wasn't fast, it was a waste of mileage. He loved the railroad train and had been riding trains since childhood. His morning train departed at 8 o'clock. It arrived at the San Francisco depot at 3rd and Townsend Streets at 8:30. On the train he read business materials, every day. If someone approached him to talk, he told them he was busy working, which he was, and then kept reading. Cool. Solitary. He then walked a mile to his office in Mills Tower at the corner of Bush and Sansom Streets. If someone wanted to walk with him, they couldn't because he walked so fast that they couldn't keep up. Cool. Solitary. A sort of gunslinger of his own creation. At Mills Tower, he took the elevator to the 18th floor and entered his office. Alone. Actually, he had 2 offices over the years. He was at Suite 1810 from World War II until 1970, when he moved to Suite 1820. The pictures on the back cover of the dust jacket of conservative investors sleep well were in both offices, and they sit today on the wall of a conference room at my corporate headquarters. His furniture never changed all those years. Same desk, which now sits in my old childhood bedroom. Chairs, and every form of appointment, none of it changed for 40 years and was all Spartan. He was Spartan. His luxury there? The view of San Francisco Bay. When he moved to 1820, he got the corner suite with bay views in 2 directions, high luxury. In the 1950s, Mills Tower was one of the city's 2 tallest office buildings, along with the Russ Building. When he moved in 1970 to Suite 1820, the view to the bay out both windows in both directions was clear. By the mid-1980s when I moved him out, he could see nothing but the taller office buildings across the street in any direction at all. Tied to the San Francisco office building boom of the 1970s, the city just grew up around him, and with the lack of bay view, much of his passion for being there faded. Each night, he walked the mile back to the train station and read more on the way home, although late in his life, as said earlier, he fell asleep a lot on the train in the afternoon. He was in the office at 9 o'clock and left at 4 o'clock to return home. When it rained, he took the bus and hated it. The bus put him in close contact with all kinds of street people after all anyone can get on the bus, and even with the best of folks, he felt uncomfortable there. Compared to most business successes, he never worked very long hours or all that hard or frantically. Early on, I marveled at how someone could have succeeded as well as he did working as few hours as he did or with as little strenuous effort as he exerted, but it was because of his genius. At times, he was like a laser beam and beautiful to behold. You only need a relative few of those times in a career to accomplish a great deal if you don't screw up too badly at other times. He had the one and not the other, and that made it work. And he was always alone. Until my brother went to work with him in 1970, he never had more than a part-time secretary around him, several half-days a week. For decades, up until the early 1970s, it was one woman, Mrs. Del Pozo. As a young man, I never got to know her in any real way at all, which I now regret because I'm sure I could have learned lots about father from her. Otherwise he was solitary. Non-social. Thinking. Reading. Talking on the phone, yes, but not oriented toward being with people. A very definite non-people person. Father loved to watch election returns. Always. A passion. He had a marvelous memory before dementia. Routinely, he memorized the names of all 435 members of the House of Representatives and the 100 senators. To put himself to sleep at night, he would go state by state through their names until he drifted off. He also memorized each state capital and made me do it as a kid. To him, reciting them wasn't challenging because they never changed. But congressmen did, which gave him new grist. The only time this ever really backfired on him was when Warren Buffett first started interacting with him. Because he had Buffett's father's name stuck in his head from Howard Buffett's days as Omaha's congressman, father kept referring to Warren Buffett as Howard, which came to periodically embarrass him when he caught it. Warren never called it to his attention. I pointed it out to father several times, and he told me to mind my own business. But he loved watching election returns because it was the beginning of the next memorization cycle. It also linked to his interest in analyzing politics, something that always fascinated him. And he wasn't bad at it. He started with an advantage. Because he had all these guys' names already memorized so well, he was a leg up on most folks. I'll bet at any one time there aren't 500 people in all of the United States who know all the names of all members of the House and the Senate. But he did. Always. Also, because he knew the names, it was easier for him than for most folk, as elections approached, to learn and to memorize which were the races that were close and could go either way. Long before folks like political analyst Charles Cook refined his analytical structure, father had the races categorized into groups by region as to safe seats for either party, semi-safe seats, and seats that were competitive to toss UPS. On election night, he would hone in on those relatively few seats that were the closest races and likely to go either way. As returns came in, he loved staying up late at night collecting data and writing them down and recalibrating what that meant to the balance of power in Congress in the next 2 years and how that might affect the president and U.S. politics in general. He was not very good at knowing what would cause those close races to likely go one way or the other, nor did he think he was, but he knew which ones were close and watched them like a hawk. Just because I knew he wasn't good at knowing what would cause them to break one way or the other, I later put effort into getting specifically trained to do just that because I wanted to learn something I knew he didn't know how to do. Late in his life, he marveled that I could do it because it was inconceivable to him that anyone could. But it is a pretty simple set of skills. The irony is that if earlier in his career someone had taught him how to do it, he could readily have done it quite well and, I'm sure, far better than I could. But another feature of his life was that any technique he didn't learn before age 50, he probably never learned. He had a lot going on by that age, which is just when common stocks and uncommon profits appeared. The book's publication tied into other personal qualities that were weird. Note his dedication in Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits. It says, this book is dedicated to all investors, large and small, who do not adhere to the philosophy, I have already made up my mind, don't confuse me with facts. As long as I knew him, in any area outside investing, he didn't want to be confused with facts because he didn't want his life disrupted because he was a creature of habit, almost above and beyond all things. Everything had to stay just as it was. You couldn't replace anything with a new and improved version. That he tore down his house and rebuilt it was miraculous. He just didn't want facts if they might lead him to change. It impacted everything from his garden to his cars, clothes, furniture, acquaintances, whatever it was, he didn't want. Changed. When I worked for him briefly, I didn't really know him well at first in a business sense, but I could see that his office was antiquated. So I set out to do minor improvements. In 1972, he still had a battery of 3 rotary dial telephones on his desk, and he was hard of hearing. So, he would be talking on one and another would ring and he would have no idea which one it was, and he would regularly pick up the wrong one and slam it back down, hurrying to the other. I installed a standard single-set, touch-tone phone with multiple lines and flashing lights. It took him months to get over being mad at me. I interfered with his world, and he could not accept it as an improvement. But he learned the business point of it, and for business he would change, and he finally got used to it. It became a new habit and he forgot he was ever mad at me. But when I was 14 and used money I'd saved from working part-time jobs to buy him a jacket to wear in the woods with me on a family trip, he would never wear it, preferring to wear, believe it or not, an old sport coat he had owned forever. He hated change. He had an old hand crank adding machine in his office that was probably first operated by Tyrannosaurus Rex. When I first saw him pounding on that darn thing, I thought his desk would implode or his wrist would shatter. 3 feet from where I sit now, I have a collection of memorabilia. One item, from his office, was an October 20th, 1961, Wall Street Journal announcement of what was the first 4-function calculator. It wasn't called that at the time. It was called a pocket computer, and it used integrated circuits, which were then called solid-circuit semiconductor networks. The calculators were for the space program and weighed 10 ounces and cost $29,350 each. My father had been one of Texas Instruments' earliest public investors as described in his FAF monograph, and by the time I arrived, he was very devoted to Texas Instruments. So, in 1973, I got him a very early commercial electronic calculator and junked his aged hand cranker. I thought he would like it because it was from Texas Instruments and was so vastly superior to his adding machine and because he could do all kinds of things not before possible. But he didn't like it one bit because it involved change, and it took him most of a year to get over being annoyed at that habit change. Still, he finally got used to it, and then it was as if he had always owned it. He sold his Texas Instruments stock in the 1980s but continued to use old and antiquated Texas Instruments calculators the rest of his career because he hated changing. By father's admission, he had just 5 friends in his whole life: David Samuels, Ed Heller, Frank Sloss, Louis Lingfeld, and John Hirschfelder, and they from fairly early on and all but one family connected. Despite all these friends being local, as a mature adult, he rarely saw them. Father knew David Samuels all his life and telephoned him regularly but only saw him, maybe, twice a year. Mentioned earlier, Ed Heller was a half-generation older and successful and wealthy before my father's time and became a major mentor early on. They met when Ed married a cousin. Heller was a successful stock market investor, an overall businessman, and a venture capitalist, and may have been the man Father admired most until the early 1950s. Heller died soon thereafter. Frank Sloss shared a room with Father at Stanford, and they remained close ever after, and, here too, Frank married a cousin and Father and Frank remained close until Frank died in the 1980s. Frank was what today we call an estate planning attorney in San Francisco and did most of Father's non-securities legal work until Frank died, and in that way they spoke often. But they saw little of each other otherwise. Louis Lingfeld was himself a distant relative and a client of Father for many years, and they often commuted together into San Francisco. I saw him far more often than the others because he lived close by and picked Father up to commute together on the train. Louis died in the 1950s, his son allegedly refused to pay the final bill, and Father sued him and won. Cool. Tough. Pretty darn solitary. And the son? He is now dead himself. Father's longest-lasting friend, John Hirschfelder, an engineer, who had been close to Father since childhood. But he only saw or spoke to Johnny maybe once every 4 years as an adult. Father couldn't stand the guy's wife, drove him crazy. Still, when Johnny was in the hospital, dying, Father made regular trips there to sit with him. Johnny was important to Father. Yet in life, he couldn't find ways to be with the man, because Father was solitary. Stoic. Alone, except with my mother. He just didn't like people very much. Most people like to be around friends, just to be with them and bask in their companionship, sort of glowing. He didn't. He liked to be alone or with my mother, and pretty much of the time when he was with my mother, they were both alone, she in the family den and he in the living room. It was just who he was. But he was beyond anxious if he was separated from her when he wasn't at work or in the garden. Other people? He just didn't like being around other people much. He liked me, but if I was around him too much, it bugged him. Or Arthur, and he liked Arthur better than anyone but my mother. But the reality is that father was just a solitary guy. Regardless of with whom he interacted, it was all relative degrees of solitude. When Arthur and then I came to work with him in the early 1970s, it drove him nuts, in my opinion. He had been pretty much alone and solitary his whole career, and being around us all that time was too much. Seeing that it drove him nuts, realizing I hadn't yet really learned who he was and, as stated earlier, realizing there wasn't a career opportunity with him because he couldn't delegate, I determined rather promptly to distance myself a bit to make him and me less nuts. I quit his employment and started out on my own within a year. But I remained in the same building. I had an unusual ability to not be bothered much by father's weirdness and to separate from him but remain fairly close. Arthur couldn't do that. Too much emotion. Arthur isn't as emotionally tough as I am, never was, I don't know why. I always thought both my brothers took father much too seriously and, ultimately, couldn't take him nearly as much or as well as I could. Ultimately father's emotion took too big a toll on Arthur, and he left the industry completely in 1977 and moved to Seattle and on to academics. My father was simply not a man to be close to people. He was pretty frugal sometimes, and when I was young and we went somewhere on business, I had to share a hotel room with him. We did this even after I could afford my own room because he couldn't handle the notion of me wasting the money. When I was about 30, I just couldn't do it anymore. But one night in the early 1970s, we were together in Monterey at one of the first elaborate dog and pony shows for technology stocks then known as the Monterey Conference, put on by the American Electronics Association. At the Monterey Conference, father exhibited another quality I never forgot. The conference announced a dinner contest. There was a card at each place setting, and each person was to write down what he or she thought the Dow Jones Industrials would do the next day, which is, of course, a silly exercise. The cards were collected. The person who came closest to the Dow's change for the day would win a mini, color TV. The winner would be announced at lunch the next day. Right after the market closed at 1 o'clock. Most folks, it turned out, did what I did, wrote down some small number, like down or up 5.57 points. I did that assuming that the market was unlikely to do anything particularly spectacular because most days it doesn't. Now in those days, the Dow was at about 900, so 5 points was neither huge nor tiny. That night, back at the hotel room, I asked father what he put down, and he said, up 30 points, which would be more than 3%. I asked why. He said he had no idea at all what the market would do, and if you knew him, you knew that he never had a view of what the market would do on a given day. But he said that if he put down a number like I did and won, people would think he was just lucky that winning at 5.57 meant beating out the guy that put down 5.5 or the other guy at 6.0. It would all be transparently seen as sheer luck. But if he won saying, up 30 points, people would think he knew something and was not just lucky. If he lost, which was probable and he expected to, no one would know what number he had written down, and it would cost him nothing. Sure enough, the next day, the Dow was up 26 points, and father won by 10 points. When it was announced at lunch that Phil Fisher had won and how high his number was, there were discernible oh and ah sounds all over the few hundred-person crowd. There was, of course, the news of the day, which attempted to explain the move, and for the rest of that conference, father readily explained to people a rationale for why he had figured out all that news in advance, which was pure fiction, and why the market had done what it did, again pure fiction and nothing but false showmanship. But I listened pretty carefully, and everyone he told all that to swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. Although he was socially ill at ease always, and insecure, I learned that day that my father was a much better showman than I had ever fathomed. And, oh, he didn't want the mini TV because he had no use at all for change in his personal life. So he gave it to me and I took it home and gave it to mother, and she used it for a very long time. The 3W. What else did my father enjoy? 3 big W's: walking, worrying, and work. He loved them all. I never really saw him relax in the ways most folks do, I think because he loved to worry so much. Underneath his surface was a sort of endless undulating nervous energy that he liked to channel into worrying. He could worry about anything. It made him feel safe in some way. It was as if he somehow believed if he worried enough, he would have covered all the risks and nothing bad could happen to him. He would worry about the same things over and over and over. Because he always worried so much and because I was always a rebel, I never much worried. That bugged him. I have always been prone to simply thinking things through as thoroughly as I can once and then going with my decision. If I conclude I'm wrong, I may conclude to change. That drove him nuts. Father used to say to me, "Ken, I wish you would run scared more often. How about just once? I just wish you would run scared." He prided himself on running scared. For the life of me, I couldn't think why I would want to live life that way, but he not only wanted that for me, he wanted it for himself. In the garden, my father could sit and worry about all the things he cared about, and that made him feel better. It may well have contributed to why he made fewer investment mistakes than most investors do. He worried everything over until he had worried it to death. Maybe he had reduced risk that way. But that also may well have contributed to why he wasn't richer than he was. He wasn't willing to take risks on things for which he hadn't worried the mistakes down to marginality. In that way, he was never a big risk taker, and those who get really rich take bigger calculated risks than he was ever willing to take. And walking? When father was on a walk, his body was purging that excess undulating energy, and he was the most relaxed I ever saw him. He could take a long walk, in either the city or the woods, and calm down. He could talk while he was walking and be calm about it. He started every workday walking to and from the train station and ended his day that way, too. And if he wasn't walking fast, it didn't count. When Arthur and I used to take the train and walk into town with him and back, we would be sweaty and uncomfortable and resentful. He never sweated. He was one who liked it hot. But that was when he could say what was on his mind in ways he never could without walking. After I moved his office to San Mateo late in his career, he walked from home and back, and he said it was the most peaceful time he had ever known as an adult, walking through San Mateo's residential gardens, gazing at the bright flowers. He was a great walker, simply great. The man's body was staggering tough. He could walk forever on legs that wouldn't quit no matter what, no matter how far or how steep the hill. He loved it. I live and work on top of a 2,000-foot-tall redwood-covered mountain overlooking the Pacific Ocean. I have lived there 30 years, and I have 200 of my 500 people up there at headquarters. And I own a stunning mountaintop ranch property nearby that is the only in-holding inside a 5,000-acre open space preserve. Once when father was 80, he and my 12-year-old son, Nathan, and I left the rest of the extended family at the ranch and started downhill, toward the Pacific, through the trees on the trails into the heart of Purisima Canyon. Father whistled and talked as if he were a boy. No worries. Walking. Walking purged worry. I've been a mountain man in this area most of my life and know it exceptionally well, and my legs are used to hills from living here. At every trail junction, I would say, "Now father, this way is the shorter, less steep, quicker way to get back, and that way is the longer, further down in the canyon, steeper way. Which way do you want to take?" At every junction, he chose the harder, longer way. We dropped 1,300 feet in elevation and walked 5 miles, at which point we had to get back up. I was a bit worried. When we stopped, Father wasn't walking, so he would start to worry. And he could worry about nothing at all and turn it into a big worry. And right then he worried that my mother would be worried that we were stranded and hurt in the woods because it was taking us so long to get back. Nathan, raised on the mountain, scampered ahead like a darting deer. As the sun started setting, Father fretted more and wanted us to pick up the pace. Of course, my mother wasn't worried. She wasn't the worrying kind. That's what he liked: walking, worrying, and work. One of the best times I ever had with my father came about by serendipity. I was 14. The family mother, father, Donald, and I were having a Wyoming dude ranch summer vacation. Arthur was gone from home by then. Father and I had been hiking daily. I was a nut about wildlife at that time, loved critters of all forms. One day we were out hiking and looking for antelope. Father was walking and talking. I was looking for antelope. We were way the heck away from the car, maybe 4 miles, in the high plateau, sparse chaparral. Summer clouds started to fill the sky, and we started drifting back toward the car. Quickly the clouds turned deadly dark. Out of nowhere, it cooled, and lightning and hail pounded all around us, huge golf ball-sized hailstones hitting us. We ran for the car. Lightning was striking everywhere. We should have flattened ourselves to the ground, but I was young and stupid and he didn't know any better, and we kept running. Lightning strikes hit the ground 10 and 25 feet from us over and over, and we were terrified. The hail was hitting my father on the top of his head, and he was holding his head and running. I was 15 and reasonably athletic. He was 59 and could keep up with me running without much problem because he had those legs that wouldn't quit. We finally made it to the car and piled into it. The lightning continued all around, but we were finally safe, and I never saw my father laugh so hard. He had run so hard that he didn't worry for an hour. In the early 1980s, Father had some bad experiences walking from the San Francisco depot to his office and back, including not watching where he was going and bonking his head on a metal post once, passing out once, and getting accosted by a wannabe mugger once. And, so, Mother and I convinced him to follow my lead by letting me move his office down the peninsula, something I had done in 1977. I moved him and set up his office in San Mateo in a little office building on 5th and El Camino Real. He continued to walk from home to work every day and loved it. Gardens. No muggers. Few stoplights or crazy taxi drivers to dodge. Beautiful flowers. No worries. As mentioned earlier, late in his life, my father started falling down in his garden on Sundays. It was an early warning of dementia's onset, but no one saw it as such at the time. In retrospect, I can see that there were other signs of it back then. But I knew nothing about dementia and couldn't recognize them. His father probably had Alzheimer's, too, but there was no such name for it back then. The early progression of the disease is often very hard to detect and impossible if you don't know what to look for, which none of us around Father did. And if we had, the tough old coot wouldn't have listened to us anyway because he was always ruggedly independent and self-willed. One of his former Stanford students, Tony Spare, who went on to run the Bank of California's money management operations and then started his own successful money management firm, long revered Father. On November 5, 1998. Tony was having a client seminar in San Francisco and asked Father to come deliver a dinner speech. Father left his San Mateo office in the late afternoon to walk to the train station to ride to the city, where he could catch a taxi downtown to Tony's event. Tony would drive him home that night. The walk was wet from the afternoon's light drizzle. As Father passed through downtown San Mateo, he saw the next stoplight starting to shift from green to yellow and he ran to beat it, something he had done all his life. As he ran off the near curb, he slipped and fell, breaking his right hip cleanly. The recovery went reasonably well, but from moment one of that trauma, dementia flooded through the opportunity like a dam breaking. As Father's body recovered, his memory and logic did less so. I was running his healthcare program and feeling pretty darned good about how well he was improving. But as so often happens with a hip break in the elderly, on January 15, 1999, he contracted pneumonia, which hit him hard and almost killed him. By January 19, he was in intensive care, and we were told to expect his death by morning. Mother was very upset. Arthur flew down from Seattle and sat the night with him. By 3, the tough old coot was pulling through, coming out of the coma and reacting initially to pinpricks to his toes. By 5, Arthur had me back down there. By 8, I was calling Mother, who was already grieving his death, telling her to get back down to meet me because she could once again talk with her husband, who was conscious and clear-eyed, even if he was still on a respirator. I assembled an around-the-clock dedicated team of nurses and injected them into the hospital with my own doctor's oversight to supervise Father as he came out of intensive care. Hospitals do the best they can with elderly patients, but their care for people in that condition is really totally inadequate, and there isn't much they can do about it because of how they function. And the family was clear that we were going to do better. This particular hospital had never before actually had anyone bring in a dedicated outside crew, but they were very good to me as I put it in place, allowing us much more freedom than I expected or deserved. It turned out that Father needed it. He was nip and tuck with death twice more before finally pulling through, including requiring on very short notice an emergency procedure that drained 1.5 quarts of fluid from his lung by needle injection and vacuum removal. The fluid had filled his lungs almost instantly. Without our dedicated crew to catch it fast, he would not have survived. But all this trauma beat up his body and mind. The entire crisis, which included several small strokes, was still another floodgate for the dementia to pour through en masse. Still, this old man's tough body recovered enough to where he could walk several miles a day and talk clearly at length, even if he couldn't remember many things. By then, however, he had forgotten pretty much everything after about 1968. Slowly, as dementia does, his long-term memories became only about older and older events. He is at the stage now where he recalls very little and recognizes very few people, typical of late dementia. The slide was a slow, irregular decline that felt amazingly swift to all of us as it occurred every few months. The only people he always knows now are my mother and me. It shocked me when he first failed to recognize Arthur, his favorite son, whom he now sometimes knows and sometimes doesn't. He remembers me because he sees me more often and long has. At home, with around-the-clock in-home help, he is bedridden, unable to walk, lacking his favorite activities of most of his life: the walking, the worrying, and the third W, working. I take care of pretty much everything in terms of health care, finances, and so on for both him and my mother. While my mother is still pretty vital, my father isn't the man I knew. Not at all. The man I knew is long gone. Today my mother puts an endless time on him but struggles under the burden. Despite his healthcare providers doing an overall great job for him, she never feels it is good enough and regularly injects herself into the middle, which ultimately drains her to exhaustion. Then, with her away, he starts calling out for her, and it is very tough on her and on everyone. I can't tell how much of a curse and how much of a blessing it will be for her when he finally passes on. It is impossible to tell. The only thing I know for sure is that old age isn't for sissies. They had 11 grandchildren and 4 great-grandchildren. The first grandchild was named after my aunt, who was named after Aunt Carrie. The second was named after my father, Philip A. Fisher. They are the only real namesakes. My father always regretted that none of his grandchildren were named after Mother, but she didn't care. It wouldn't be like her to fret over something like that. Because Father had his own children fairly late in life, he was really closest to his oldest grandchildren. Mother, being the baby of her family, was more naturally drawn to her younger grandchildren. 2 of the great-grandchildren my parents barely know. The other 2 they have never met, all residing far, far away. Only a few of the grandchildren have any real sense of the man I knew. They never saw the mirror. Significance: the mirror image. My father is a great man who influenced many people, great and small, from national business leaders to students of his students who went into other fields. He had a knack for getting people to see things they wouldn't see otherwise, not by telling them but by somehow getting them to think thoughts they don't believe they ever would have thought without interaction with him. At times it was like he was a mirror held up to your brain. I can't tell you how many people over the decades said something to me like, "I met him once. It was only briefly, but he said X, Y, and Z, and that made me think, and that gave me the idea I used in starting my company." It was, of course, their idea, but they somehow credited him with some of its creation. He brought that quality out in people. Somehow he made people think things that they might have thought anyway, but for sure they believed they thought them because of interactions with Father. I remember some of these people clearly, and to my certain knowledge Father didn't say the things that some people thought he said. But somehow they heard the right words anyway, and that is all that counts for them. His writings are like that, too, and always have been for many people. Many investors have told me over the decades how they did this or that because of something they read in Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits or in Conservative Investors Sleep Well. Of course, they didn't. They did whatever they did because of something in them, in their mind. But they believe it was inspired by something they read in those books. The books are good. The inspirations are even better. And that is a very good thing. If you read my father's writings and ideas come to you, ones he never really said, and if you are motivated by them, so much the better. It is another reason that rereading his books is useful. Somehow, my father was a mirror for many people. He let them see themselves in ways they believe they wouldn't have otherwise. Now, 45 years after Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits first appeared, my father will never directly have that impact on. Introduction. Anyone again. But his writings carry on. If you've never read him, I hope you enjoy this man. If you've read him before, I welcome you back. With the response his writings have received over these 45 years, it is quite clear they will be here for you for the remainder of your life and probably far, far after, just as his memory will be for me. Part 1. Common Stocks and Uncommon Profits. Preface. The publication of a new book in the field of investment may well require some explanatory statement from its author. The following remarks will therefore have to be somewhat personal in order to supply an adequate explanation for my venturing to offer another book on this subject to the investing public. After 1 year in Stanford University's then brand new Graduate School of Business Administration, I entered the business world in May 1928. I went to work for, and 20 months later was made the head of, the statistical department of one of the main constituent units of the present Crocker Anglo National Bank of San Francisco. Under today's nomenclature I would have been called a security analyst. Here I had a ringside seat at the incredible financial orgy that culminated in the autumn of 1929, as well as the period of adversity that followed. My observations led me to believe that there was a magnificent opportunity on the West Coast for a specialized investment counseling firm that would make itself the direct antithesis of that ancient but uncomplimentary description of certain stockbrokers, men who know the price of everything and the value of nothing. On March 1, 1931, I started Fisher & Co., which, at that time, was an investment counseling business serving the general public but with its interests centered largely around a few growth companies. This activity prospered. Then came World War II. For 3.5 years, while I was engaged in various desk jobs for the Army Air Force, I spent part of such spare time as I had in reviewing both the successful and, more particularly, the unsuccessful investment actions that I had taken and that I had seen others take during the preceding 10 years. I began seeing certain investment principles emerge from this review which were different from some of those commonly accepted as gospel in the financial community. When I returned to civilian life, I decided to put these principles into practice in a business atmosphere as little disturbed by side issues as possible. Instead of serving the general public, Fisher & Co. for over 11 years has never served more than a dozen clients at one time. Most of these clients have remained the same during this period. Instead of being mainly interested in major capital appreciation, all Fisher & Co. activity has been focused upon this one objective. I am aware that these past 11 years have been a period of generally rising stock prices during which anyone engaged in such activities should have made good profits. Nevertheless, by the degree to which these funds have consistently forged ahead of the generally recognized indices of the market as a whole, I find that following these principles has justified itself even more thoroughly in the post-war period than was the case in the 10 pre-war years when I was only partially applying them. Perhaps even more significant, they have been no less rewarding during those of these years when the general market was static or declining than when it was sharply advancing. In studying the investment record both of myself and others, two matters were significant influences in causing this book to be written. One, which I mentioned several times elsewhere, is the need for patience if big profits are to be made from investment. Put another way, it is often easier to tell what will happen to the price of a stock than how much time will elapse before it happens. The other is the inherently deceptive nature of the stock market. Doing what everybody else is doing at the moment, and therefore what you have an almost irresistible urge to do, is often the wrong thing to do at all. For these reasons, over the years I have found myself explaining in great detail to the owners of the funds I manage the principles behind one or another action I have taken. Only in this way would they have enough understanding of why I was acquiring some, to them, totally unknown security, so that there would be no impulse to dispose of it before enough time had elapsed for the purchase to begin justifying itself in market quotations. Gradually the desire arose to compile these investment principles and have a printed record to which I could point. This resulted in the first groping toward organizing this book. Then I began thinking of the many people, most of them owners of far smaller funds than those belonging to the handful of individuals it is my business to serve, who have come to me over the years and asked how they as small investors could get started off on the right path. I thought of the difficulties of the army of small investors who have unintentionally picked up all sorts of ideas and investment notions that can prove expensive over a period of years, possibly because they had never been exposed to the challenge of more fundamental concepts. Finally, I thought of the many discussions I have had with another group also vitally interested in these matters, although from a different standpoint. These are the corporate presidents, financial vice presidents and treasurers of publicly owned companies, many of whom show a deep interest in learning as much as possible about these matters. I concluded there was need for a book of this sort. I decided such a book would have an informal presentation in which I would try to address you, the reader, in the first person. I would use much the same language and many of the same examples and analogies that I have employed in presenting the same concepts to those whose funds I manage. I hope my frankness, at times my bluntness, will not cause offense. I particularly hope that you will conclude the merit of the ideas I present may outweigh my defects as a writer. San Mateo, California, September 1957. Clues from the past, clues from the past. You have some money in the bank. You decide you would like to buy some common stock. You may have reached this decision because you desire to have more income than you would if you used these funds in other ways. You may have reached it because you want to grow with America. Possibly you think of earlier years when Henry Ford was starting the Ford Motor Company or Andrew Mellon was building up the Aluminum Company of America, and you wonder if you could not discover some young enterprise which might today lay the groundwork for a great fortune for you, too. Just as likely you are more afraid than hopeful and want to have a nest egg against a rainy day. Consequently, after hearing more and more about inflation, you desire something which will be safe and yet protected from further shrinkage in the buying power of the dollar. Probably your real motives are a mixture of a number of these things, influenced somewhat by knowing a neighbor who has made some money in the market and, possibly, by receiving a pamphlet in the mail explaining just why Midwestern pumpernickel is now a bargain. A single basic motive lies behind all this, however. For one reason or another, through one method or another, you buy common stocks in order to make money. Therefore, it seems logical that before even thinking of buying any common stock, the first step is to see how money has been most successfully made in the past. Even a casual glance at American stock market history will show that two very different methods have been used to amass spectacular fortunes. In the 19th century and in the early part of the 20th century, a number of big fortunes and many small ones were made largely by betting on the business cycle. In a period when an unstable banking system caused recurring boom and bust, buying stocks in bad times and selling them in good had strong elements of value. This was particularly true for those with good financial connections who might have some advance information about when the banking system was becoming a bit strained. But perhaps the most significant fact to be realized is that even in the stock market era, which started to end with the coming of the Federal Reserve System in 1913 and became history with the passage of the Securities and Exchange legislation in the early days of the Roosevelt administration, those who used a different method made far more money and took far less risk. Even in those earlier times, finding the really outstanding companies and staying with them through all the fluctuations of a gyrating market proved far more profitable to far more people than did the more colorful practice of trying to buy them cheap and sell them dear. If this statement appears surprising, further amplification of it may prove even more so. It may also provide the key to open the first door to successful investing. Listed on the various stock exchanges of the nation today are not just a few, but scores of companies in which it would have been possible to invest, say, $10,000 somewhere between 25 and 50 years ago, and today have this purchase represent anywhere from $250,000 to several times this amount. In other words, within the lifetime of most investors and within the period in which their parents could have acted for nearly all of them, there were available scores of opportunities to lay the groundwork for substantial fortunes for oneself or one's children. These opportunities did not require purchasing on a particular day at the bottom of a great panic. The shares of these companies were available year after year at prices that were to make this kind of profit possible. What was required was the ability to distinguish these relatively few companies with outstanding investment possibilities from the much greater number whose future would vary all the way from the moderately successful to the complete failure. Are there opportunities existing today to make investments that in the years ahead will yield corresponding percentage gains? The answer to this question deserves rather detailed attention. If it be in the affirmative, the path for making real profits through common stock investment starts to become clear. Fortunately, there is strong evidence indicating that the opportunities of today are not only as good as those of the first quarter of this century but are actually much better. One reason for this is the change that has occurred during this period in the fundamental concept of corporate management and the corresponding changes in handling corporate affairs that this has brought about. A generation ago, heads of a large corporation were usually members of the owning family. They regarded the corporation as a personal possession. The interests of outside stockholders were largely ignored. If any consideration at all was given to the problem of management continuity, that is, of training younger men to step into the shoes of those whose age might make them no longer available, the motive was largely that of taking care of a son or a nephew who would inherit the job. Providing the best available talent to protect the average stockholder's investment was seldom a matter in the forefront of the minds of management. In that age of autocratic personal domination, the tendency of aging management was to resist innovation or improvement and frequently to refuse even to listen to suggestions or criticism. This is a far cry from today's constant competitive search to find ways of doing things better. Today's top corporate management is usually engaged in continuous self-analysis and, in a never-ending search for improvement, frequently even goes outside its own organization by consulting all sorts of experts in its effort to get good advice. In former days there was always great danger that the most attractive corporation of the moment would not continue to stay ahead in its field, or, if it did, that the insiders would grab all the benefits for themselves. Today, investment dangers like these, while not entirely a thing of the past, are much less likely to prove a hazard for the careful investor. One facet of the change that has come over corporate management is worthy of attention. This is the growth of the corporate research and engineering laboratory, an occurrence that would hardly have benefited the stockholder if it had not been accompanied by corporate management's learning a parallel technique whereby this research could be made a tool to open up a golden harvest of ever-growing profits to the stockholder. Even today, many investors seem but slightly aware of how fast this development has come, how much further it is almost certainly going, and its impact on basic investment policy. Actually, even by the late 1920s, only a half dozen or so industrial corporations had significant research organizations. By today's standards, their size was small. It was not until the fear of Adolf Hitler accelerated this type of activity for military purposes that industrial research really started to grow. It has been growing ever since. A survey made in the spring of 1956, published in Businessweek and a number of other McGraw-Hill trade publications, indicated that in 1953 private corporate expenditures for research and development were about $3.7 billion. By 1956 they had grown to $5.5 billion, and present corporate planning called for this to be running at the rate of better than $6.3 billion by 1959. Equally startling, this survey indicated that by 1959, or in just 3 years, a number of our leading industries expect to get from 15% to more than 20% of their total sales from products which were not in commercial existence in 1956. In the spring of 1957 the same source made a similar survey. If the totals revealed in 1956 were startling in their significance, those revealed just 1 year later might be termed explosive. Research expenditures were up 20% from the previous year's total to $7.3 billion. This represents almost a 100% growth in 4 years. It means the actual growth in 12 months was $1 billion more than only a year before had been expected as the total growth that would occur in the ensuing 36 months. Meanwhile, anticipated research expenditures in 1960 were estimated at $9 billion. Furthermore, all manufacturing industries, rather than just a few selected industries as represented in the earlier survey, expected that 10% of 1960 sales would be from products not yet in commercial existence only 3 years before. For certain selected industries, this percentage from which sales representing merely new model and style changes had been excluded was several times higher. The impact of this sort of thing on investment can hardly be overstated. The cost of this type of research is becoming so great that the corporation which fails to handle it wisely from a commercial standpoint may stagger under a crushing burden of operating expense. Furthermore, there is no quick and easy yardstick for either management or the investor to measure the profitability of research. Just as even the ablest professional baseball player cannot expect to get a hit much more often than 1 out of every 3 times he comes to bat, so a sizable number of research projects, governed merely by the law of averages, are bound to produce nothing profitable at all. Furthermore, by pure chance, an abnormal number of such unprofitable projects may happen to be bunched together in one particular span of time in even the best run commercial laboratory. Finally, it is apt to take from 7 to 11 years from the time a project is first conceived until it has a significant favorable effect on corporate earnings. Therefore, even the most profitable of research projects is pretty sure to be a financial drain before it eventually adds to the stockholder's profit. But if the cost of poorly organized research is both high and hard to detect, the cost of too little research may be even higher. During the next few years, the introduction of many kinds of new materials and new types of machinery will steadily narrow the market for thousands of companies, possibly entire industries, which fail to keep pace with the times. So will such major changes in basic ways of doing things as will be brought about by the adoption of electronic computers for the keeping of records and the use of irradiation for industrial processing. However, other companies will be alert to the trends and will maneuver to make enormous sales gains from such awareness. The managements of certain of such companies may continue to maintain the highest standards of efficiency in handling their day-to-day operations while using equally good judgment in keeping ahead of the field on these matters affecting the long-range future. Their fortunate stockholders, rather than the proverbial meek, may well inherit the earth. In addition to these influences of the changed outlook in corporate management and the rise of research, there is a third factor likewise tending to give today's investor greater opportunities than those existing in most past periods. Later in this book, in those sections dealing with when stocks should be bought and sold, it would seem more appropriate to discuss what, if any, influence the business cycle should have on investment policies. But discussion of one segment of this subject seems called for at this point. This is the greater advantage in owning certain types of common stocks, as a result of a basic policy change that has occurred within the framework of our federal government, largely since 1932. Both prior to and since that date, regardless of how little they had to do with bringing it about, both major parties took and usually received credit for any prosperity that might occur when they were in power. Similarly, they were usually blamed by both the opposition and the general public if a bad slump occurred. However, prior to 1932 there would have been serious question from the responsible leadership of either party as to whether there was any moral justification or even political wisdom in deliberately running a huge deficit in order to buttress ailing segments of business. Fighting unemployment by methods far more costly than the opening of breadlines and soup kitchens would not have been given serious consideration, regardless of which party might have been in office. Since 1932 all that is reversed. The Democrats may or may not be less concerned with a balanced federal budget than the Republicans. However, from President Eisenhower on down, with the possible exception of former Secretary of the Treasury Humphrey, the responsible Republican leadership has said again and again that if business should really turn down they would not hesitate to lower taxes or make whatever other deficit-producing moves were necessary to restore prosperity and eliminate unemployment. This is a far cry from the doctrines that prevailed prior to the Big Depression. Even if this change in policy had not become generally accepted, certain other changes have occurred that would produce much the same results, though possibly not so quickly. The income tax only became legal during the Wilson administration. It was not a major influence on the economy until the 1930s. In earlier years, much of the federal revenue came from customs duties and similar excise sources. These fluctuated moderately with the level of prosperity but as a whole were fairly stable. Today, in contrast, about 80% of the federal revenue comes from corporate and personal income taxes. This means that any sharp decline in the general level of business causes a corresponding decline in federal revenue. Meanwhile, various devices such as farm price supports and unemployment compensation have become embedded in our laws. At just the time that a business decline would be greatly reducing the federal government's income, expenditures in these fields made mandatory by legislation would cause governmental expenses to mount sharply. Add to this the definite intention of reversing any unfavorable business trend by cutting taxes, building more public works, and lending money to various hard-pressed business groups, and it becomes increasingly plain that if a real depression were to occur the federal deficit could easily run at a rate of $25 to $30 billion per annum. Deficits of this type would produce further inflation in much the same way that the deficits resulting from wartime expenditures produced the major price spirals of the post-war period. This means that when a depression does occur it is apt to be shorter than some of the Great Depressions of the past. It is almost bound to be followed by enough further inflation to produce the type of general price rise that in the past has helped certain industries and hurt others. With this general economic background, the menace of the business cycle may well be as great as it ever was for the stockholder in the financially weak or marginal company. But to the stockholder in the growth company with sufficient financial strength or borrowing ability to withstand a year or two of hard times, a business decline under today's economic conditions represents far more a temporary shrinking of the market value of his holdings than the basic threat to the very existence of the investment itself that had to be reckoned with prior to 1932. Another basic financial trend has resulted from this built-in inflationary bias having become embedded so deeply in both our laws and our accepted concepts of the economic duties of government. Bonds have become undesirable investments for the strictly long-term holdings of the average individual investor. The rise in interest rates that had been going on for several years gained major momentum in the fall of 1956. With high-grade bonds subsequently selling at the lowest prices in 25 years, many voices in the financial community were raised to advocate switching from stocks which were selling at historically high levels into such fixed-income securities. The abnormally high yield of bonds over dividend return on stocks in relation to the ratio that normally prevails would appear to have given strong support to the soundness of this policy. For the short term, such a policy sooner or later may prove profitable. As such, it might have great appeal for those making short or medium-term investments, that is, for traders with the acuteness and sense of timing to judge when to make the necessary buying and selling moves. This is because the coming of any significant business recession is almost certain to cause an easing of money rates and a corresponding rise in bond prices at a time when equity quotations are hardly likely to be buoyant. This leads us to the conclusion that high-grade bonds may be good for the speculator and bad for the long-term investor. This seems to run directly counter to all normally accepted thinking on this subject. However, any understanding of the influences of inflation will show why this is likely to be the case. In its letter of December 1956, the First National City Bank of New York furnished a table showing the worldwide nature of the depreciation in the purchasing power of money that occurred in the 10 years from 1946 to 1956. 16 of the major nations of the free world were included in this table. In every one of them the value of money significantly declined. These declines ranged from a minimum in Switzerland, where at the end of the 10-year period money would buy 85% of what could be purchased 10 years before, to the other extreme in Chile, where in 10 years it had lost 95% of its former value. In the United States this decline amounted to 29%, and in Canada to 35%. This means that in the United States the annual rate of monetary depreciation during the period was 3.4%, and in Canada it was 4.2%. In contrast, the yield offered by United States government bonds bought at the beginning of the period, which admittedly was one of rather low interest rates, was only 2.19%. This means that the holder of this type of high-grade, fixed-income security actually received negative interest of better than 1% per annum if the real value of his money is considered. Suppose, however, that instead of acquiring bonds at the rather low rates that prevailed at the beginning of this period, the investor could have bought them at the rather high interest rates that prevailed 10 years later. The First National City Bank of New York in the same article also supplied figures on this matter. At the end of the period covered in the article, they estimated the return on United States government bonds at 3.27%, which still would leave no return whatever, actually a slight loss, on the investment. However, 6 months after this article was written, interest rates had risen sharply, and were above 3.5%. How would the investor actually have fared if he had had the opportunity at the beginning of this period to invest with the highest returns that have prevailed in over a quarter of a century? In the great majority of cases he would still have gotten no real return on his investment. In many instances he would have had an actual loss. This is because nearly all such bond purchasers would have had to pay at least a 20% income tax on the interest received before the genuine rate of their return on the investment could have been calculated. In many cases the bondholder's tax would have been at a considerably higher rate, since only the first $2,000 to $4,000 of taxable income qualifies at this 20% level. Similarly, if an investor had purchased tax-free municipal bonds at this all-time high, the somewhat lower interest rate that these tax-free securities carry would again not have provided any real return on his investment. Of course, these figures are only conclusive for this one 10-year period. They do indicate, however, that these conditions are worldwide, and therefore not too likely to be reversed by political trends in any one country. What is really important concerning the attractiveness of bonds as long-term investments is whether a similar trend can be expected in the period ahead. It seems to me that if this whole inflation mechanism is studied carefully, it becomes clear that major inflationary spurts arise out of wholesale expansions of credit, which in turn result from large government deficits greatly enlarging the monetary base of the credit system. The huge deficit incurred in winning World War II laid such a base. The result was that pre-war bondholders who have maintained their positions in fixed income securities have lost over half the real value of their investments. As already explained, our laws, and more importantly our accepted beliefs of what should be done in a depression, make one of two courses seem inevitable. Either business will remain good, in which event outstanding stocks will continue to outperform bonds, or a significant recession will occur. If this happens, bonds should temporarily outperform the best stocks, but a train of major deficit-producing actions will then be triggered that will cause another major decline in the true purchasing power of bond-type investments. It is almost certain that a depression will produce further major inflation. The extreme difficulty of determining when in such a disturbing period bonds should be sold makes me believe that securities of this type are, in our complex economy, primarily suited either to banks, insurance companies, and other institutions that have dollar obligations to offset against them, or to individuals with short-term objectives. They do not provide for sufficient gain to the long-term investor to offset this probability of further depreciation in purchasing power. Before going further, it might be well to summarize briefly the various investment clues that can be gleaned from a study of the past and from a comparison of the major differences, from an investment standpoint, between the past and the present. Such a study indicates that the greatest investment reward comes to those who by good luck or good sense find the occasional company that over the years can grow in sales and profits far more than industry as a whole. It further shows that when we believe we have found such a company we had better stick with it for a long period of time. It gives us a strong hint that such companies need not necessarily be young and small. Instead, regardless of size, what really counts is a management having both a determination to attain further important growth and an ability to bring its plans to completion. The past gives us a further clue that this growth is often associated with knowing how to organize research in the various fields of the natural sciences so as to bring to market economically worthwhile and usually interrelated product lines. It makes clear to us that a general characteristic of such companies is a management that does not let its preoccupation with long-range planning prevent it from exerting constant vigilance in performing the day-to-day tasks of ordinary business outstandingly well. Finally, it furnishes considerable assurance that in spite of the very many spectacular investment opportunities that existed 25 or 50 years ago, there are probably even more such opportunities available today. 2. What scuttlebutt can do. As a general description of what to look for, all this may be helpful. But as a practical guide for finding outstanding investments, it obviously contributes relatively little. Granted that this furnishes a broad outline of the type of investment that should be sought, how does the investor go about finding the specific company which might open the way to major appreciation? One way that immediately suggests itself is logical but rather impractical. This is to find someone who is sufficiently skilled in the various facets of management to examine each subdivision of a company's organization and by detailed investigation of its executive personnel, its production, its sales organization, its research, and each of its other major functions, form a worthwhile conclusion as to whether the particular company has outstanding potentialities for growth and development. Such a method may appear sensible. Unfortunately, there are several reasons why it usually will not serve the average investor very well. In the first place, there are only a few individuals who have the necessary degree of top management skill to do a job of this kind. Most of them are busy at top-level and high-paying management jobs. They have neither the time nor the inclination to occupy themselves in this way. Furthermore, if they were so inclined, it is doubtful if many of the real growth companies of the nation would allow someone outside their own organization to have all the data necessary to make an informed decision. Some of the knowledge gained in this way would be too valuable to existing or potential competition to permit its being passed on to anyone having no responsibility to the company furnishing the data. Fortunately, there is another course which the investor can pursue. If properly handled, this method will provide the clues that are needed to find really outstanding investments. For lack of a better term, I shall call this way of proceeding the scuttlebutt method. As this method is spelled out in detail in the pages that follow, the average investor will have one predominant reaction. This is that regardless of how beneficial this scuttlebutt method may be to someone else, it is not going to be helpful to him, because he just won't have much chance to apply it. I am aware that most investors are not in a position to do for themselves much of what is needed to get the most from their investment funds. Nevertheless, I think they should thoroughly understand just what is needed and why. Only in this way are they in a position to select the type of professional advisor who can best help them. Only in this way can they adequately evaluate the work of that advisor. Furthermore, when they understand not only what can be accomplished, but also how it can be accomplished, they may be surprised at how from time to time they may be in a position to enrich and make more profitable the worthwhile work already being done for them by their investment advisors. The business grapevine is a remarkable thing. It is amazing what an accurate picture of the relative points of strength and weakness of each company in an industry can be obtained from a representative cross-section of the opinions of those who in one way or another are concerned with any particular company. Most people, particularly if they feel sure there is no danger of their being quoted, like to talk about the field of work in which they are engaged and will talk rather freely about their competitors. Go to 5 companies in an industry, ask each of them intelligent questions about the points of strength and weakness of the other 4, and 9 times out of 10 a surprisingly detailed and accurate picture of all 5 will emerge. However, competitors are only one and not necessarily the best source of informed opinion. It is equally astonishing how much can be learned from both vendors and customers about the real nature of the people with whom they deal. Research scientists in universities, in government, and in competitive companies are another fertile source of worthwhile data. So are executives of trade associations. In the case of trade association executives especially, but to a great extent the other groups as well, it is impossible to lay too much stress on the importance of 2 matters. The inquiring investor must be able to make clear beyond any doubt that his source of information will never be revealed. Then he must scrupulously live up to this policy. Otherwise, the danger of getting an informant into trouble is obviously so great that unfavorable opinions just do not get passed along. There is still one further group which can be of immense help to the prospective investor in search of a bonanza company. This group, however, can be harmful rather than helpful if the investor does not use good judgment and does not do plenty of cross-checking with others to verify his own judgment as to the reliability of what is told him. This group consists of former employees. Such people frequently have a real inside view in regard to their former employer's strengths and weaknesses. Equally important, they will usually talk freely about them. But enough such former employees may, rightly or wrongly, feel they were fired without good cause or left because of a justified grievance that it is always important to check carefully into why employees left the company being studied. Only then is it possible to determine the degree of prejudice that may exist and to allow for it in considering what the former employee has to say. If enough different sources of information are sought about a company, there is no reason to believe that each bit of data obtained should agree with each other bit of data. Actually, there is not the slightest need for this to happen. In the case of really outstanding companies, the preponderant information is so crystal clear that even a moderately experienced investor who knows what he is seeking will be able to tell which companies are likely to be of enough interest to him to warrant taking the next step in his investigation. This next step is to contact the officers of the company to try and fill out some of the gaps still existing in the investor's picture of the situation being studied. 3. What to buy. The 15 points to look for in a common stock. What are these matters about which the investor should learn if he is to obtain the type of investment which in a few years might show him a gain of several 100%, or over a longer period of time might show a correspondingly greater increase? In other words, what attributes should a company have to give it the greatest likelihood of attaining this kind of results for its shareholders? There are 15 points with which I believe the investor should concern himself. A company could well be an investment bonanza if it failed fully to qualify on a very few of them. I do not think it could come up to my definition of a worthwhile investment if it failed to qualify on many. Some of these points are matters of company policy, others deal with how efficiently this policy is carried out. Some of these points concern matters which should largely be determined from information obtained from sources outside the company being studied, while others are best solved by direct inquiry from company personnel. These 15 points are: 1. Does the company have products or services with sufficient market potential to make possible a sizable increase in sales for at least several years? It is by no means impossible to make a fair one-time profit from companies with a stationary or even a declining sales curve. Operating economies resulting from better control of costs can at times create enough improvement in net income to produce an increase in the market price of a company's shares. This sort of one-time profit is eagerly sought by many speculators and bargain hunters. It does not offer the degree of opportunity, however, that should interest those desiring to make the greatest possible gains from their investment funds. Neither does another type of situation which sometimes offers a considerably larger degree of profit. Such a situation occurs when a changed condition opens up a large increase in sales for a period of a very few years, after which sales stop growing. A large-scale example of this is what happened to the many radio set manufacturers with the commercial development of television. A huge increase in sales occurred for several years. Now that nearly 90% of United States homes that are wired for electricity have television sets, the sales curve is again static. In the case of a great many companies in the industry, a large profit was made by those who bought early enough. Then as the sales curve leveled out, so did the attractiveness of many of these stocks. Not even the most outstanding growth companies need necessarily be expected to show sales for every single year larger than those of the year before. In another chapter I will attempt to show why the normal intricacies of commercial research and the problems of marketing new products tend to cause such sales increases to come in an irregular series of uneven spurts rather than in a smooth year-by-year progression. The vagaries of the business cycle will also have a major influence on year-to-year comparisons. Therefore, growth should not be judged on an annual basis but, say, by taking units of several years each. Certain companies give promise of greater than normal growth not only for the next several year period, but also for a considerable time beyond that. Those companies which decade by decade have consistently shown spectacular growth might be divided into two groups. For lack of better terms I will call one group those that happen to be both fortunate and able, and the other group those that are fortunate because they are able. A high order of management ability is a must for both groups. No company grows for a long period of years just because it is lucky. It must have and continue to keep a high order of business skill, otherwise it will not be able to capitalize on its good fortune and to defend its competitive position from the inroads of others. What to buy? The Aluminum Company of America is an example of the fortunate and able group. The founders of this company were men with great vision. They correctly foresaw important commercial uses for their new product. However, neither they nor anyone else at that time could foresee anything like the full size of the market for aluminum products that was to develop over the next 70 years. A combination of technical developments and economies, of which the company was far more the beneficiary than the instigator, was to bring this about. Alcoa has and continues to show a high order of skill in encouraging and taking advantage of these trends. However, if background conditions, such as the perfecting of airborne transportation, had not caused influences completely beyond Alcoa's control to open up extensive new markets, the company would still have grown but at a slower rate. The aluminum company was fortunate in finding itself in an even better industry than the attractive one envisioned by its early management. The fortunes made by many of the early stockholders of this company who held on to their shares is of course known to everyone. What may not be so generally recognized is how well even relative newcomers to the stockholder list have done. When I wrote the original edition, Alcoa shares were down almost 40% from the all-time high made in 1956. Yet at this low price the stock showed an increase in value of almost 500% over not the low price, but the median average price at which it could have been purchased in 1947, just 10 years before. Now let us take DuPont as an example of the other group of growth stocks, those which I have described as fortunate because they are able. This company was not originally in the business of making nylon, cellophane, lucite, neoprene, Orlon, mylar, or any of the many other glamorous products with which it is frequently associated in the public mind and which have proven so spectacularly profitable to the investor. For many years DuPont made blasting powder. In time of peace, its growth would largely have paralleled that of the mining industry. In recent years, it might have grown a little more rapidly than this as additional sales volume accompanied increased activity in road building. None of this would have been more than an insignificant fraction of the volume of business that has developed, however, as the company's brilliant business and financial judgment teamed up with superb technical skill to attain a sales volume that is now exceeding $2 billion each year. Applying the skills and knowledge learned in its original powder business, the company has successfully launched product after product to make one of the great success stories of American industry. The investment novice taking his first look at the chemical industry might think it is a fortunate coincidence that the companies which usually have the highest investment rating on many other aspects of their business are also the ones producing so many of the industry's most attractive growth products. Such an investor is confusing cause and effect to about the same degree as the unsophisticated young lady who returned from her first trip to Europe and told her friends what a nice coincidence it was that wide rivers often happened to flow right through the heart of so many of the large cities. Studies of the history of corporations such as DuPont or Dow or Union Carbide show how clearly this type of company falls into the fortunate because they are able group so far as their sales curve is concerned. Possibly one of the most striking examples of these, fortunate because they are able, companies is General American Transportation. A little over 50 years ago when the company was formed, the railroad equipment industry appeared a good one with ample growth prospects. In recent years, few industries would appear to offer less rewarding prospects for continued growth. Yet when the altered outlook for the railroads began to make the prospects for the freight car builders increasingly less appealing, brilliant ingenuity and resourcefulness kept this company's income on a steady uptrend. Not satisfied with this, the management started taking advantage of some of the skills and knowledge learned in its basic business to go into other unrelated lines, affording still further growth possibilities. A company which appears to have sharply increasing sales for some years ahead may prove to be a bonanza for the investor, regardless of whether such a company more closely resembles the fortunate and able or the fortunate because it is able type. Nevertheless, examples such as General American Transportation make one thing clear. In either case, the investor must be alert as to whether the management is and continues to be of the highest order of ability. Without this, the sales growth will not continue. Correctly judging the long-range sales curve of a company is of extreme importance to the investor. Superficial judgment can lead to wrong conclusions. For example, I have already mentioned radio-television stocks as an instance where instead of continued long-range growth there was one major spurt as the homes of the nation acquired television sets. Nevertheless, in recent years certain of these radio-television companies have shown a new trend. They have used their electronic skills to build up sizable businesses in other electronic fields such as communication and automation equipment. These industrial and, in some cases, military electronic lines give promise of steady growth for many years to come. In a few of these companies, such as Motorola for example, they already are of more importance than the television operation. Meanwhile, certain new technical developments afford a possibility that in the early 1960s current model television sets will appear as awkward and obsolete as the original wall-type crank-operated hand telephones appear today. One potential development, color television, has possibly been over-discounted by the general public. Another is a direct result of transistor development in printed circuitry. It is a screen-type television with sets that would be little different in size and shape from the larger pictures we now have on our walls. The present bulky cabinet would be a thing of the past. Should such developments obtain mass commercial acceptance, a few of the technically most skillful of existing television companies might enjoy another major spurt in sales even larger and longer lasting than that which they experienced a few years ago. Such companies would find this spurt superimposed on a steadily growing industrial and military electronics business. They would then be enjoying the type of major sales growth which should be the first point to be considered by those desiring the most profitable type of investments. I have mentioned this example not as something which is sure to happen, but rather as something which could easily happen. I do so because I believe that in regard to a company's future sales curve there is one point that should always be kept in mind. If a company's management is outstanding and the industry is one subject to technological change and development research, the shrewd investor should stay alert to the possibility that management might handle company affairs so as to produce in the future exactly the type of sales curve that is the first step to consider in choosing an outstanding investment. Since I wrote these words in the original edition, it might be interesting to note, not what is sure to happen, or may happen, but what has happened in regard to Motorola. We are not yet in the early 1960s, the closest time to which I refer as affording a possibility of developing television models that will obsolete those of the 1950s. This has not happened nor is it likely to do so in the near future. But in the meanwhile, let us see what an alert management has done to take advantage of technological change to develop the type of upward sales curve that I stated was the first requisite of an outstanding investment. Motorola has made itself an outstanding leader in the field of two-way electronic communications that started out as a specialty for police cars and taxicabs, and now appears to offer almost unlimited growth. Trucking companies, owners of delivery fleets of all types, public utilities, large construction projects, and pipelines are but a few of the users of this type of versatile equipment. Meanwhile, after several years of costly developmental effort, the company has established a semiconductor division on a profitable basis which appears headed toward obtaining its share of the fabulous growth trend of that industry. It has become a major factor in the new field of stereophonic phonographs and is obtaining an important and growing new source of sales in this way. By a rather unique style tie-in with a leading national furniture manufacturer, it has significantly increased its volume in the higher-priced end of its television line. Finally, through a small acquisition it is just getting into the hearing aid field and may develop other new specialties as well. In short, while sometime in the next decade important major stimulants may cause another large spurt in its original radio-television lines, this has not happened yet nor is it likely to happen soon. Yet management has taken advantage of the resources and skills within the organization again to put this company in line for growth. Is the stock market responding to this? When I finished writing the original edition, Motorola was 45.5. Today it is 122. When the investor is alert to this type of opportunity, how profitable may it be? Let us take an actual example from the industry we have just been discussing. In 1947 a friend of mine in Wall Street was making a survey of the infant television industry. He studied approximately a dozen of the principal set producers over the better part of a year. His conclusion was that the business was going to be competitive, that there were going to be major shifts in position between the leading concerns, and that certain stocks in the industry had speculative appeal. However, in the process of this survey it developed that one of the great shortages was the glass bulb for the picture tube. The most successful producer appeared to be Corning Glass Works. After further examination of the technical and research aspects of Corning Glass Works it became apparent that this company was unusually well qualified to produce these glass bulbs for the television industry. Estimates of the possible market indicated that this would be a major source of new business for the company. Since prospects for other product lines seemed generally favorable, this analyst recommended the stock for both individual and institutional investment. The stock at that time was selling at about 20. It has since been split to 1/2 for L and 10 years after his purchase was selling at over 100, which was the equivalent of a price of 250 on the old stock. 2. Does the management have a determination to continue to develop products or processes that will still further increase total sales potentials when the growth potentials of currently attractive product lines have largely been exploited? Companies which have a significant growth prospect for the next few years because of new demand for existing lines, but which have neither policies nor plans to provide for further developments beyond this may provide a vehicle for a nice one-time profit. They are not apt to provide the means for the consistent gains over 10 or 25 years that are the surest route to financial success. It is at this point that scientific research and development engineering begin to enter the picture. It is largely through these means that companies improve old products and develop new ones. This is the usual route by which a management not content with one isolated spurt of growth sees that growth occurs in a series of more or less continuous spurts. The investor usually obtains the best results in companies whose engineering or research is to a considerable extent devoted to products having some business relationship to those already within the scope of company activities. This does not mean that a desirable company may not have a number of divisions, some of which have product lines quite different from others. It does mean that a company with research centered around each of these divisions, like a cluster of trees each growing additional branches from its own trunk, will usually do much better than a company working on a number of unrelated new products which, if successful, will land it in several new industries unrelated to its existing business. At first glance, point may second appear to be a mere repetition of point 1. This is not the case. Point 1 is a matter of fact, appraising the degree of potential sales growth that now exists for a company's product. Point 2 is a matter of management attitude. Does the company now recognize that in time it will almost certainly have grown up to the potential of its present market and that to continue to grow it may have to develop further new markets at some future time? It is the company that has both a good rating on the first point and an affirmative attitude on the second that is likely to be of the greatest investment interest. 3. How effective are the company's research and development efforts in relation to its size? For a large number of publicly owned companies, it is not too difficult to get a figure showing the number of dollars being spent each year on research and development. Since virtually all such companies report their annual sales total, it is only a matter of the simplest mathematics to divide the research figure by total sales and so learn the percent of each sales dollar that a company is devoting to this type of activity. Many professional investment analysts like to compare this research figure for one company with that of others in the same general field. Sometimes they compare it with the average of the industry, by averaging the figures of many somewhat similar companies. From this, conclusions are drawn both as to the importance of a company's research effort in relation to competition and the amount of research per share of stock that the investor is getting in a particular company. Figures of this sort can prove a crude yardstick that may give a worthwhile hint that one company is doing an abnormal amount of research or another not nearly enough. But unless a great deal of further knowledge is obtained, such figures can be misleading. One reason for this is that companies vary enormously in what they include or exclude as research and development expense. One company will include a type of engineering expense that most authorities would not consider genuine research at all, since it is really tailoring an existing product to a particular order, in other words, sales engineering. Conversely, another company will charge the expense of operating a pilot plant on a completely new product to production rather than research. Most experts would call this a pure research function, since it is directly related to obtaining the know-how to make a new product. If all companies were to report research on a comparable accounting basis, the relative figures on the amount of research done by various well-known companies might look quite different from those frequently used in financial circles. What to buy? In no other major subdivision of business activity are to be found such great variations from one company to another between what goes in as expense and what comes out in benefits as occurs in research. Even among the best managed companies, this variation seems to run in a ratio of as much as 2 to 1. By this is meant some well-run companies will get as much as twice the ultimate gain for each research dollar spent as will others. If averagely run companies are included, this variation between the best and the mediocre is still greater. This is largely because the big strides in the way of new products and processes are no longer the work of a single genius. They come from teams of highly trained men, each with a different specialty. One may be a chemist, another a solid-state physicist, a third a metallurgist, and a fourth a mathematician. The degree of skill of each of these experts is only part of what is needed to produce outstanding results. It is also necessary to have leaders who can coordinate the work of people of such diverse backgrounds and keep them driving toward a common goal. Consequently, the number or prestige of research workers in one company may be overshadowed by the effectiveness with which they are being helped to work as a team in another. Nor is a management's ability to coordinate diverse technical skills into a closely knit team and to stimulate each expert on that team to his greatest productivity the only kind of complex coordination upon which optimum research results depend. Close and detailed coordination between research workers on each developmental project and those thoroughly familiar with both production and sales problems is almost as important. It is no simple task for management to bring about this close relationship between research, production, and sales. Yet unless this is done, new products as finally conceived frequently are either not designed to be manufactured as cheaply as possible, or, when designed, fail to have maximum sales appeal. Such research usually results in products vulnerable to more efficient competition. Finally, there is one other type of coordination necessary if research expenditures are to attain maximum efficiency. This is coordination with top management. It might perhaps better be called top management's understanding of the fundamental nature of commercial research. Development projects cannot be expanded in good years and sharply curtailed in poor ones without tremendously increasing the total cost of reaching the desired objective. The crash programs so loved by a few top managements may occasionally be necessary but are often just expensive. A crash program is what occurs when important elements of the research personnel are suddenly pulled from the projects on which they have been working and concentrated on some new task which may have great importance at the moment but which, frequently, is not worth all the disruption it causes. The essence of successful commercial research is that only tasks be selected which promise to give dollar rewards of many times the cost of the research. However, once a project is started, to allow budget considerations and other extraneous factors outside the project itself to curtail or accelerate it invariably expands the total cost in relation to the benefits obtained. Some top managements do not seem to understand this. I have heard executives of small but successful electronic companies express surprisingly little fear of the competition of one of the giants of the industry. This lack of worry concerning the ability of the much larger company to produce competitive products is not due to lack of respect for the capabilities of the larger company's individual researchers or unawareness of what might otherwise be accomplished with the large sums the big company regularly spends on research. Rather, it is the historic tendency of this larger company to interrupt regular research projects with crash programs to attain the immediate goals of top management that has produced this feeling. Similarly, some years ago I heard that while they desired no publicity on the matter for obvious reasons, an outstanding technical college quietly advised its graduating class to avoid employment with a certain oil company. This was because top management of that company had a tendency to hire highly skilled people for what would normally be about 5-year projects. Then in about 3 years the company would lose interest in the particular project and abandon it, thereby not only wasting their own money but preventing those employed from gaining the technical reputation for accomplishment that otherwise might have come to them. Another factor making proper investment evaluation of research even more complex is how to evaluate the large amount of research related to defense contracts. A great deal of such research is frequently done not at the expense of the company doing it, but for the account of the federal government. Some of the subcontractors in the defense field also do significant research for the account of the contractors whom they are supplying. Should such totals be appraised by the investor as being as significant as research done at a company's own expense? If not, how should it be valued in relation to company-sponsored research? Like so many other phases in the investment field, these matters cannot be answered by mathematical formulae. Each case is different. The profit margin on defense contracts is smaller than that of non-government business, and the nature of the work is often such that the contract for a new weapon is subject to competitive bidding from government blueprints. This means that it is sometimes impossible to build up steady repeat business for a product developed by government-sponsored research in a way that can be done with privately sponsored research, where both patents and customer goodwill can frequently be brought into play. For reasons like these, from the standpoint of the investor, there are enormous variations in the economic worth of different government-sponsored research projects, even though such projects might be roughly equal in their importance so far as the benefits to the defense effort are concerned. The following theoretical example might serve to show how 3 such projects might have vastly different values to the investor. One project might produce a magnificent new weapon having no non-military applications. The rights to this weapon would all be owned by the government and, once invented, It would be sufficiently simple to manufacture that the company which had done the research would have no advantage over others in bidding for a production contract. Such a research effort would have almost no value to the investor. Another project might produce the same weapon, but the technique of manufacturing might be sufficiently complex that a company not participating in the original development work would have great difficulty trying to make it. Such a research project would have moderate value to the investor since it would tend to assure continuous, though probably not highly profitable, business from the government. Still another company might engineer such a weapon and in so doing might learn principles and new techniques directly applicable to its regular commercial lines, which presumably show a higher profit margin. Such a research project might have great value to the investor. Some of the most spectacularly successful companies of the recent past have been those that show a high order of talent for finding complex and technical defense work, the doing of which provides them at government expense with know-how that can legitimately be transferred into profitable non-defense fields related to their existing commercial activities. Such companies are providing the government the research results the defense authorities vitally need. However, at the same time, they are obtaining, at little or no cost, related non-defense research benefits which otherwise they would probably be paying for themselves. This factor may well have been one of the reasons for the spectacular investment success of Texas Instruments, Inc., which in 4 years rose nearly 500% from the price of $5.14 at which it traded when first listed on the New York Stock Exchange in 1953. It may also have contributed, in the same period, to the even greater 700% rise experienced by Ampex shareholders from the time this company's shares were first offered to the public in the same year. Finally, in judging the relative investment value of company research organizations, another type of activity must be evaluated. This is something which ordinarily is not considered as developmental research at all, the seemingly unrelated field of market research. Market research may be regarded as the bridge between developmental research and sales. Top management must be alert against the temptation to spend significant sums on the research and development of a colorful product or process which, when perfected, has a genuine market but one too small to be profitable. By too small to be profitable I mean one that never will enjoy a large enough sales volume to get back the cost of the research, much less a worthwhile profit for the investor. A market research organization that can steer a major research effort of its company from one project which if technically successful would have barely paid for itself, to another which might cater to so much broader a market that it would pay out 3 times as well, would have vastly increased the value to its stockholders of that company's scientific manpower. If quantitative measurements such as the annual expenditures on research or the number of employees holding scientific degrees are only a rough guide and not the final answer to whether a company has an outstanding research organization, how does the careful investor obtain this information? Once again it is surprising what the scuttlebutt method will produce. Until the average investor tries it, he probably will not believe how complete a picture will emerge if he asks intelligent questions about a company's research activities of a diversified group of research people, some from within the company and others engaged in related lines in competitive industries, in universities, and in government. A simpler and often worthwhile method is to make a close study of how much in dollar sales or net profits has been contributed to a company by the results of its research organization during a particular span, such as the prior 10 years. An organization which in relation to the size of its activities has produced a good flow of profitable new products during such a period will probably be equally productive in the future as long as it continues to operate under the same general methods. For does the company have an above-average sales organization? In this competitive age, the products or services of few companies are so outstanding that they will sell to their maximum potentialities if they are not expertly merchandised. It is the making of a sale that is the most basic single activity of any business. Without sales, survival is impossible. It is the making of repeat sales to satisfied customers that is the first benchmark of success. Yet, strange as it seems, the relative efficiency of a company's sales, advertising, and distributive organizations receives far less attention from most investors, even the careful ones, than do production, research, finance, or other major subdivisions of corporate activity. There is probably a reason for this. It is relatively easy to construct simple mathematical ratios that will provide some sort of guide to the attractiveness of a company's production costs, research activity, or financial structure in comparison with its competitors. It is a great deal harder to make ratios that have even a semblance of meaning in regard to sales and distribution efficiency. In regard to research, we have already seen that such simple ratios are far too crude to provide anything but the first clues as to what to look for. Their value in relation to production and the financial structure will be discussed shortly. However, whether or not such ratios have anything like the value frequently placed upon them in financial circles, the fact remains that investors like to lean upon them. Because sales effort does not readily lend itself to this type of formulae, many investors fail to appraise it at all in spite of its basic importance in determining real investment worth. Again, the way out of this dilemma lies in the use of the scuttlebutt technique. Of all the phases of a company's activity, none is easier to learn about from sources outside the company than the relative efficiency of a sales organization. Both competitors and customers know the answers. Equally important, they are seldom hesitant to express their views. The time spent by the careful investor in inquiring into this subject is usually richly rewarded. What to buy? I am devoting less space to this matter of relative sales ability than I did to the matter of relative research ability. This does not mean that I consider it less important. In today's competitive world, many things are important to corporate success. However, outstanding production, sales, and research may be considered the three main columns upon which such success is based. Saying that one is more important than another is like saying that the heart, the lungs, or the digestive tract is the most important single organ for the proper functioning of the body. All are needed for survival, and all must function well for vigorous health. Look around you at the companies that have proven outstanding investments. Try to find some that do not have both aggressive distribution and a constantly improving sales organization. I have already referred to the Dow Chemical Company and may do so several times again, as I believe this company, which over the years has proven so rewarding to its stockholders, is an outstanding example of the ideal conservative long-range investment. Here is a company which in the public mind is almost synonymous with outstandingly successful research. However, what is not as well known is that this company selects and trains its sales personnel with the same care as it handles its research chemists. Before a young college graduate becomes a Dow salesman, he may be invited to make several trips to Midland so that both he and the company can become as sure as possible that he has the background and temperament that will fit him into their sales organization. Then, before he so much as sees his first potential customer, he must undergo specialized training that occasionally lasts only a few weeks but at times continues for well over a year to prepare him for the more complex selling jobs. This is but the beginning of the training he will receive. Some of the company's greatest mental effort is devoted to seeking and frequently finding more efficient ways to solicit from, service, and deliver to the customer. Are Dow and the other outstanding companies in the chemical industry unique in this great attention paid to sales and distribution? Definitely not. In another and quite different industry, International Business Machines is a company which has handsomely rewarded its owners. An IBM executive recently told me that the average salesman spends a third of his entire time training in company-sponsored schools. To a considerable degree, this amazing ratio results from an attempt to keep the sales force abreast of a rapidly changing technology. Nevertheless, I believe it one more indication of the weight that most successful companies give to steadily improving their sales arm. A one-time profit can be made in the company which because of manufacturing or research skill obtains some worthwhile business without a strong distribution organization. However, such companies can be quite vulnerable. For steady long-term growth, a strong sales arm is vital. 5. Does the company have a worthwhile profit margin? Here at last is a subject of importance which properly lends itself to the type of mathematical analysis which so many financial people feel is the backbone of sound investment decisions. From the standpoint of the investor, sales are only of value when and if they lead to increased profits. All the sales growth in the world won't produce the right type of investment vehicle if, over the years, profits do not grow correspondingly. The first step in examining profits is to study a company's profit margin, that is, to determine the number of cents of each dollar of sales that is brought down to operating profit. The wide variation between different companies, even those in the same industry, will immediately become apparent. Such a study should be made, not for a single year, but for a series of years. It then becomes evident that nearly all companies have broader profit margins as well as greater total dollar profits in years when an industry is unusually prosperous. However, it also becomes clear that the marginal companies, that is, those with the smaller profit margins, nearly always increase their profit margins by a considerably greater percentage in the good years than do the lower cost companies, whose profit margins also get better but not to so great a degree. This usually causes the weaker companies to show a greater percentage increase in earnings in a year of abnormally good business than do the stronger companies in the same field. However, it should also be remembered that these earnings will decline correspondingly more rapidly when the business tide turns. For this reason, I believe that the greatest long-range investment profits are never obtained by investing in marginal companies. The only reason for considering a long-range investment in a company with an abnormally low profit margin is that there might be strong indications that a fundamental change is taking place within the company. This would be such that the improvement in profit margins would be occurring for reasons other than a temporarily expanded volume of business. In other words, the company would not be marginal in the true sense of the word, since the real reason for buying is that efficiency or new products developed within the company have taken it out of the marginal category. When such internal changes are taking place in a corporation which in other respects pretty well qualifies as the right type of long-range investment, it may be an unusually attractive purchase. So far as older and larger companies are concerned, most of the really big investment gains have come from companies having relatively broad profit margins. Usually they have among the best such margins in their industry. In regard to young companies, and occasionally older ones, there is one important deviation from this rule. A deviation, however, that is generally more apparent than real. Such companies will at times deliberately elect to speed up growth by spending all or a very large part of the profits they would otherwise have earned on even more research or on even more sales promotion than they would otherwise be doing. What is important in such instances is to make absolutely certain that it is actually still further research, still further sales promotion, or still more of any other activity which is being financed today so as to build for the future, that is the real cause of the narrow or non-existent profit margin. The greatest care should be used to be sure that the volume of the activities being credited with reducing the profit margin is not merely the volume of these activities needed for a good rate of growth, but actually represents even more research, sales promotion, etc., than this. When this happens, the research company with an apparently poor profit margin may be an unusually attractive investment. However, with the exception of companies of this type in which the low profit margin is being deliberately engineered in order to further accelerate the growth rate, investors desiring maximum gains over the years had best stay away from low profit margin or marginal companies. 6. What is the company doing to maintain or improve profit margins? The success of a stock purchase does not depend on what is generally known about a company at the time the purchase is made. Rather, it depends upon what gets to be known about it after the stock has been bought. Therefore, it is not the profit margins of the past but those of the future that are basically important to the investor. In the age in which we live, there seems to be a constant threat to profit margins. Wages and salary costs go up year by year. Many companies now have long-range labor contracts calling for still further increases for several years ahead. Rising labor costs result in corresponding increases in raw materials and supplies. The trend of tax rates, particularly real estate and local tax rates, also seems to be steadily increasing. Against this background, different companies are going to have different results in the trend of their profit margins. Some companies are in the seemingly fortunate position that they can maintain profit margins simply by raising prices. This is usually because they are in industries in which the demand for their products is abnormally strong or because the selling prices of competitive products have gone up even more than their own. In our economy, however, maintaining or improving profit margins in this way usually proves a relatively temporary matter. This is because additional competitive production capacity is created. This new capacity sufficiently outbalances the increased gain so that, in time, cost increases can no longer be passed on as price increases. Profit margins then start to shrink. A striking example of this is the abrupt change that occurred in the fall of 1956, when the aluminum market went in a few weeks from a condition of short supply to one of aggressive competitive selling. Prior to that time, aluminum prices rose about with costs. Unless demand for the product should grow even faster than production facilities, future price increases will occur less rapidly. Similarly, the persistent